Swagkage and Noodles recently held a 4-hour-long debate on the Itachi vs. Pain matchup. In that time, they managed to touch on a huge range of topics, from things directly related to the fight, like the strength of the Amaterasu and Chibaku Tensei, to more general, wider-ranging ideas, like Naruto's battle intelligence and how to use and interpret databook statements. With so many ideas being discussed, it's only natural that some of the points thrown out there would be incorrect or at least incomplete. Nobody's perfect, and Naruto is a very long series. That being said, I just want to list off some of the arguments that were presented. See if you can spot any potential issues with these. Jiraiya killed 5 paths of pain. Konohamaru is as fast as all of the paths of pain. Itachi blinded all the animal path summons with kunai. Konan is not an Akatsuki member. The Rasen shuriken is slower than Naruto himself. The human path soul-stealing ability doesn't work on anyone stronger than Susanoo. Naruto is a dumbass with low battle intelligence, and the Amaterasu is the strongest physical attack in the series. You may have noticed some inconsistencies in that list, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. Despite being entertaining throughout, the debate was unfortunately plagued by misremembered scenes, misunderstood narratives, and misconstrued context. In my opinion, neither speaker argued successfully for their chosen fighter, and the main reason for all of that is that there was just a fundamental misunderstanding of the scenes being referenced. So what this video is a reference point. I'm going to go through all of the major points raised in the debate, point out any issues I can find, and do my best to clear them up. To do that, we're going to need to cover a lot of ground and do some deep dives. We'll be reviewing the mechanics of the Shinra Tensei, Chibaku Tensei, and Edo Tensei, Naruto's battle intelligence, the definition of a ninjutsu, the mechanics of Sage Mode, Genjutsu functionality and resistances, the limitations of the Yaramir and the Sword of Totsuka, and more. We'll also go over databook statements and talk about how to use those effectively in debates. Also, if you're interested in the Itachi vs. Pain matchup in general, but have no interest in the debate I'm reviewing, I encourage you to stick around anyway. The focus of this video is on the characters and their feats, and the narrative surrounding them, more so than on the semantics and drama of the debate itself. So I'm hoping it's going to be a useful reference for anybody interested in either of these characters, or even in just any of the jutsu we're going to talk about. Alright, with the intros out of the way, let's dive right in. Before we get into the thick of things here, I want to talk about the way the databook statements are used in debates. If you're not familiar, the databooks are official published volumes that contain all kinds of information about character stats, jutsu, and things like maps and plot summaries to help fans better understand the universe. They're written by the author, Kishimoto, and are official releases, so they're canon. Oftentimes, they also add details or help to clarify ambiguous things from the series, so they're a useful resource. It's no surprise that they get referenced a lot in these debates. That all being said, the databooks are a supplementary source of information. Any evidence we get from a databook statement needs to be weighed against evidence from the manga, and ultimately the manga is our primary source of information. The databook entries are often written with exaggerated, hyperbolic, and colorful language, and sometimes they're outright contradictions of what we actually see in the manga. There are several jutsu, for example, that are described as being peerless, invincible, inescapable, or having no counters, which wind up being blatantly untrue because we see them being thwarted on panel. One example is on page 289 of the third databook, where it's said of the transfer seal Amaterasu that there is no jutsu to escape its fury, and yet Obito escapes it a few panels after it's used on him. So it would obviously be pretty silly to argue that the Amaterasu cannot be escaped just because the databook said so when we actively see it being escaped on panel, right? Here's another example. On page 247 of the third databook, we find the entry for Kirin. Now, the description says it vanquishes the enemy in a flash, and that thunder claps and the enemy is defeated. The Kirin only gets used once in the entire series, and we don't see it defeat anyone, so the description doesn't match up with what happens in the manga. So when the debaters reference statements like the Sword of Totsuka can cut down any enemy, and the Yaramir can repel any attack, those statements should be evaluated the same way we would evaluate that claim about the transfer seal Amaterasu. While some of the statements in the databooks can be taken at face value, like a character's blood type, their elemental affinities, or how many successful missions they've completed, there are also a lot of statements that need to be taken with a grain of salt. In other words, just because a statement appears in a databook does not mean it should necessarily be taken literally. To further illustrate this point, I've made a list of statements from the databooks that are similarly exaggerated or played up, and I'm going to use them to make a case for why we should always take statements like these with a grain of salt. I'm going to start with a few more examples from the third databook, since that's the one that's most relevant to this debate, and we're also going to evaluate whether Noodles is correct that the statements about the Yatamira and Totsuka blade are the most disgusting statements in the third databook. If you think you already kind of get my point and/or you're not really all that interested in the databooks, feel free to skip past this section to dive right into the arguments about Itachi versus Pain. Or feel free to stick around, we'll start with the third databook and then look at statements from the first, second, and fourth as well. So, starting with the third databook, in Pain's character profile on page 157, it's stated that because he is immortal, he is unbeatable. So, do we really agree that Pain categorically cannot be defeated based on this statement? On page 240, for the jutsu entry on Kakashi's Kamui, we're told that this is an unmatched jutsu, and that the target will struggle but there is no defense against this jutsu. This is reiterated on page 241, where it's stated that there is no jutsu to fight this. This statement alone is a counterpoint to the Totsuka blade's description being the most impressive entry in the book, because Itachi has to actually physically hit his targets with the sword to seal them, whereas all Kakashi needs to do is focus on them with his vision, and there's no counter, right? On page 259, we get this line from the description of Iron Sand Shower. Because Iron Sand possesses magnetic properties and contains poison, it is impossible to defend against. Let's repeat that. Sasori supposedly has an attack that is impossible to defend against. How well do you think that statement holds up against what we see in the manga? On page 292, in description of Deidara's clay doppelganger, it's said that no jutsu can rescue the victim. Does this match up against what we see in the Sasuke fight? And finally, the actual most disgusting statement in the third databook comes from Orochimaru's Mandala of Endless Snakes formation. I'll quote, "In the face of overwhelming numbers of snakes, defense or avoidance lose their meaning as all the target can do is be buried in snakes. Also, when the endless number of snakes that come slithering out gather together, they become a defense that can block any sort of attack." So, if we give this the same treatment as the Yatamir and the Totsuka blade descriptions and take it literally, this jutsu cannot be avoided and it cannot be blocked. The snakes can also block literally any other attack, and where the Yatamir and Totsuka blade are single weapons tied to Itachi's Susanoo, this stream of snakes is described multiple times as being endless, so Orochimaru can just send out a literally infinite number of snakes until his opponent is overwhelmed and defeated. Now, to be very clear, I hope you don't take that Orochimaru statement literally, especially with how the jutsu is actually used versus Naruto. I hope you can look at a statement like that and say, okay, the language used here is clearly exaggerated for effect. The jutsu is definitely strong, really strong in fact, but that doesn't mean Orochimaru could solo Madara and Hashirama by drowning them in danger noodles. Obviously, all jutsu, even the most extreme, have limitations and weaknesses, so when you're evaluating their powers in a versus battle, those things always need to be taken into account. Okay, let's continue with some examples from the fourth databook. The description for Konan's Paper Person of God technique says, the explosion created by the chain of explosive tags is impossible to escape no matter what kind of jutsu you use. Obito escaped from it anyway. For Killer Bee's Octopus Hold, the statement reads that victims get laid before the final moments, and it is impossible to escape this torture technique. An impossible to escape technique in which his opponents get laid, huh? What's Killer Bee up to exactly? Anyway, he used this jutsu on the Jinchuriki, and they escaped. Madara's Fire Release Great Fire Annihilation description says there is no way out from this technique. Obito's Bomb Blast Dance description says the opponent is enveloped in the vortex, giving them no option for escape, leaving them to suffer and burn. But the allied shinobi forces stopped Madara and Obito's combined attack with their own combined water wall. Madara's Storm Release Light Fang is described as being impossible to dodge, but Naruto dodges it the one time it's used. And Onoki's Dust Released is said to not have any counter, jutsu or tool-wise, but Madara says that he's able to absorb it without issue. Now for some examples from the second databook. Jiraiya's Toad-Mouth Bind is described as an inescapable otherworldly space. Inescapable, but Itachi and Kisame escape from it. Temari's Quick Beheading Dance is stated to slash through everything it touches. Should we take everything literally there? Gaara's Prison Sand Burial entry says there is no such thing as a jutsu that allows escape from the flow drawing towards the bottom of the earth. Do you agree that no character can escape from this jutsu, including, say, Kimimaro? And for Tsunade's Heavenly Foot of Pain, the quote is, "Nothing and no one could receive a direct hit and avoid pulverization." So how do you feel about the idea that Tsunade could one-shot Hashirama, Madara, or Kurama, all characters that are mentioned in the second databook? And finally, some statements from the first databook. For Shadow of the Dancing Leaf, it's called a perfect dance of pursuit that no one escapes from. For Blade of Wind, it's described as an uncatchable, unavoidable longsword. For Sasuke's Great Fireball technique, the quote is, "The massive flame engulfs and vaporizes everything." For Sand-Binding Coffin, there is no escaping it, regardless of the defensive strategy adopted. For Extreme Decapitating Airwaves, ultimate pressure which reduces everything to dust. It's an ultrasound pressure of the air that destroys everything in its path. Great Waterfall technique says the manipulated water turns into a waterfall, washing away absolutely everything in sight. Kabuto's Temple of Nirvana description says, no matter how much one resists the hypnotic spell, the desire to sleep is instinctive and there's no fighting it. The instant the white feathers go, an irresistible sleep comes. And finally, the description of the demonic mirroring ice crystal says, it is said that no method in existence can defeat this technique. So, you see, while the databooks can provide us with plenty of meaningful and useful information, sometimes the statements are hyperbolic, sometimes they're a bit tongue-in-cheek, and sometimes they're just flat-out incorrect. This doesn't mean we should discard them wholesale, don't get me wrong, there's some nuance here. My point is that we need to take these statements in context and weigh them against other pieces of evidence. They are not end-all, be-all sources of truth. I encourage you to keep that in mind when the debaters start dropping statements about how things can cut down any enemy or deflect any attack. One of the most important things to establish in any matchup is the relative speed of the characters. So we're going to start by looking at Swag's first major speed argument from the debate. Swag starts off by saying that the Preta Path blitzed the Rasen Shuriken in the Pain vs Naruto fight, implying that he should then be significantly faster than Sage Naruto. Noodles counters this by saying, well, he blitzed the Rasen Shuriken, not Sage Naruto himself, and claims that he doesn't think the Rasen Shuriken scales to Sage Naruto anyway. This kicks off an extended argument about the Rasen Shuriken's relative speed. Before we get into that, let's examine whether what Preta did was actually a blitz, and then we'll examine Noodles' relative speed claim. Swag's point is that since Preta intercepted the Rasen Shuriken at the last second, it moved faster than Naruto could notice or react to. In theory, this is supported by the fact that Naruto has heightened perception in Sage mode, but when you look at the context of this moment in the fight, Naruto's not actually in Sage mode for most of it. He's in base while he's getting pressed by Tendo. He's also distracted by working with Fukasaku to summon in his Sage clone. Naruto does get Sage mode back right before he throws the Rasen Shuriken, but even then his focus is on Tendo and he's not expecting Preta to be active at all. His mental focus, regardless of Sage mode, is just not on Preta, or on the Naraka path for that matter. Noodles points this out, and with one of his better arguments, and with an analogy I really like, describes how Sage mode doesn't inherently give you omniscience. Keep in mind that Preta being resurrected by the Naraka path happens entirely off-panel, so we don't get to see how long it takes for the King of Hell to resurrect him, and we don't know when Preta starts moving to intercept the Rasen Shuriken. That makes it really hard to tell exactly how fast Preta is moving since we don't know when he starts moving. It is possible that Tendo specifically wanted to let Preta intercept the Rasen Shuriken to absorb its chakra as well. And also, if you look at the motion lines on Preta as he lands in front of Tendo, it actually looks like he's coming in from above Tendo rather than off to the side. And we know that the Naraka gate is off to Naruto's right since Naruto just looks over and sees it there. So it might be the case that the Preta path either jumped into the air or started moving into position before Naruto got Sage mode back. It could also be that the Preta path blitzed the Shuriken at the last second like Swag is saying, but we don't know because we can't see what he's up to. Regarding Naruto's focus, he does just look to his right and see Naraka standing there with the gate active and everything, so Preta being collected and resurrected happened right there on the battlefield in plain view. Naruto should have just been able to see it straight up even without Sage mode, but he's distracted, so he doesn't notice it. And because of all that, it's hard to get a really meaningful speed calc for Preta from this feat. Noodles makes the claim that the Rasen Shuriken is not as fast as Sage Naruto, but he fails to provide tangible evidence for that point. He mentions that there are other jutsu that are not inherently as fast as their users, but he doesn't provide any data about the Rasen Shuriken itself. No calcs for how fast it actually is relative to Naruto, no statements from any characters or from the databooks about its actual speed. But there's actually a lot of evidence in the Pain vs Naruto fight alone that the Rasen Shuriken is as fast as, if not faster than, Naruto. Maybe the most obvious example comes from the very end of the Pain fight. Naruto prepares a base for Sengon, and he needs it to connect with Pain as quickly as possible before Shinra Tensei comes off a cooldown. He chooses to have 2 clones grab him and throw him as hard as possible. This goes to show that Naruto can throw stuff faster than he can run, and if he can throw his own body faster than he can run, he can throw the Rasen Shuriken faster than he can run, even if that just means readying a Rasen Shuriken and having his clones throw him, like what happened here. Naruto actually did this once before, back in chapter 226. Naruto's fighting Sasuke here, and they're both charging at one another. Sasuke is going full out with his Chidori, and Naruto's coming at him with a Rasengan. He obviously wants to have as much force and speed behind it as possible, and he chooses to have a Shadow Clone grab him by the arm and hurl him forward at Sasuke. This suggests that Naruto thought he'd be able to generate more power by throwing himself forward than just by running. He could have done the same thing with a Rasen Shuriken if he's so much slower than he is. And if you're wondering about whether or not he'd take recoil or blowback damage from the Rasen Shuriken's explosion, we'll talk about that more soon, but spoiler alert, it's not going to be a problem either. For more info, let's look at the next time Naruto uses the Rasen Shuriken in the fight. Naruto first throws down a smoke bomb, and we see what looks like a Rasen Shuriken coming out of the smoke and heading towards Preda, but this is actually Naruto himself in disguise. Preda is able to raise his hands up to try to intercept it, so he sees it and he reacts to it, and then Naruto untransforms and tackles him. At this point, we see a second Rasen Shuriken, a real one this time, coming out of the smoke. It covers the same distance that Naruto had just traveled himself before Naruto and Preda hit the ground. Naruto also sent a clone up out of the smoke to take out the Naraka path, and that clone arrives several moments after the Rasen Shuriken is negated by Tendo. To reiterate, Naruto's clone arrives after the Rasen Shuriken, despite being launched first or at least around the same time. Granted, you have to account for his vertical displacement here, so he's moving a little further in total, but not by a huge margin, right? To summarize all that, the Rasen Shuriken appears to travel the same distance in less time as Naruto's movement speed. At the very least, there's nothing here showing it to be significantly slower. There are 2 more examples I'd like to talk about. For the record, I know that the Rasen Shuriken gets faster over the course of the series, but so does Naruto. What we're measuring here is the speed of the Rasen Shuriken relative to Naruto, not its absolute speed. Let's look at chapter 632. Team 7 are rushing towards the Ten Tails clones to engage them with taijutsu. Once they get within range, the clones are able to react to and block Naruto and Sasuke's attacks. Now, Sakura comes in and punches one of the clones and sends it flying. She then leaps into the air, moving further forward and creating this massive impact. Then, when her back is turned, she's about to be attacked by another clone, and Naruto and Sasuke have to make a split-second decision to help her. They both choose to use ranged attacks, and Naruto uses the Rasen Shuriken, which appears to connect with their targets nearly instantly across this vast distance. Then they jump in and join Sakura, arriving a beat later. The Rasen Shuriken is able to reach the target nearly instantly. It takes them more time to physically arrive at the location. That, plus the fact that Naruto chose the Rasen Shuriken instead of dashing in, are evidence that it's faster than he is. Add that to the fact that the clones who were able to respond to and block close quarters attacks were unable to dodge or block the ranged attacks. That kinda suggests that the Rasen Shuriken in flight is faster than Naruto's base taijutsu speed. The other example is in chapter 617. Naruto's leading the charge towards Obito and Madara with the goal of severing their connections with the Ten Tails. They want to close the distance as quickly as possible and cut off the umbilical cords. Naruto throws a Rasen Shuriken at Obito right after having his shoulder dislocated and repaired mid-battle, mind you, and Obito has no reaction or response to it. It cuts right through the umbilical connection. Meanwhile, Lee springboards off a guy and basically kicks Madara in half, breaking his connection, and Madara doesn't react to that either. Both Lee and the Rasen Shuriken arrive at essentially the same time. Naruto then arrives later after the Rasen Shuriken has already left the area. Once again, the Rasen Shuriken is clearly moving faster than Naruto. If Naruto were able to move faster than it, he could have simply springboarded off of one of his own clones, like Lee is doing here, like Naruto himself has done in the past, and just gone for the umbilical with taijutsu, or with a Rasen Shuriken held in the hand. Nothing here hints that the Rasen Shuriken is in any way slower than Naruto. I'll reiterate one more time that we never actually get any statements from any characters about the Rasen shuriken being slower than Naruto, and keep in mind this is the signature move of the entire series. So in what way is the Rasen shuriken, basically a baseball made of wind with a saw blade frisbee in the middle of it, slower than the person throwing it? On panel, the Rasen shuriken is consistently at least as fast as Naruto, probably significantly faster in fact. It's even described in the databooks as being a flawless jutsu once Naruto develops it fully. A projectile-based attack that's slower than the person launching it. That sounds like a pretty significant flaw, don't you think? If the debaters had just taken a moment to actually scale the speed of the Rasen shuriken, they could have avoided a gridlock that wound up taking up a huge chunk of the debate. Instead, they unfortunately got bogged down in a series of logical or narrative arguments about how it could be slower, instead of actually measuring whether it is slower. I want to go over these arguments for the sake of being thorough, but to be clear, none of this is really necessary since we can just scale the jutsu inherently. Noodles mentions that jutsu, as a general rule, do not all necessarily scale in speed to the user, which seems like a fair point at first. But the examples he provides, namely the Fireball Jutsu and the Truth-Seeking Orbs, immediately illustrate the problem with this position. Neither of those are thrown projectile jutsu launched using the caster's full body strength. Specifically, the Fireball Jutsu is used by gathering chakra between the mouth and chest, holding it, and then blasting it out in a single breath, so using the air in your lungs to propel it forward. This is not really analogous to throwing a sphere. The Truth-Seeking Orbs also aren't launched projectiles. They passively follow their users around until being sent out using the caster's will, not using their physical throwing strength. The reference to the Truth-Seeking Orbs here is also a bit out of context. Let's examine Noodle's point. He mentions that Sage Minato was reacted to by Jubi Madara, but Base Minato was able to teleport to and react to Madara's Truth-Seeking Orbs, which would be proof that the orbs are slower than Madara. But he leaves out some important details. When Minato engages with Madara, he first throws a kunai at Madara's feet, which Madara is able to see coming. Minato then starts this joint attack with Gaara and teleports to Madara with his arm back, holding a Rasengan. Madara is then able to cut off his arm and kick Minato back. So he's able to respond to an attack he sees coming directly in taijutsu range. Later, when the Truth-Seeking Orbs are sent out, they've already been accelerated in another direction, away from Madara. Lee throws a kunai into their path, and then Minato essentially blinks in and out to intercept the orbs. The orbs are already fully accelerated in their target direction and don't have autonomy. Madara doesn't have a chance to react to Minato's attack and change their trajectory. Minato doesn't stay in place for any amount of time, and doesn't try to do any additional maneuvering like he did previously with the Rasengan. There's no direct comparison at all between an individual's close quarters taijutsu reactions and the ability of a semi-autonomous projectile that's already being accelerated to change its velocity in mid-flight while away from its user. It's also worth noting that we see characters like the Sage of Six Paths Naruto, Obito, and Madara himself zipping around the battlefield at incredibly high speeds, and the orbs stick to them consistently, which suggests that even if they are slower in the Minato example, they're generally relative to their owners overall. The exception being when Obito is teleported away by Minato and Tobirama, the orbs aren't teleported with him, but that's teleportation rather than base movement. So it is true that ninjutsu don't necessarily scale to their users in speed, but is it fair to say the same thing for thrown ninjutsu, launched using the caster's own body strength? Noodles says he doesn't think Naruto's throwing speed scales to his own taijutsu speed. I'm not sure how that would even be possible, since taijutsu is essentially just how fast you can move your arms, legs, and body to react to and deliver physical attacks. And the mechanics of throwing an object are highly similar to, say, throwing a straight with all your power behind it. It's basically taijutsu either way, right? So why would one be slower than the other? I struggled to find a single example of any character in the series who was able to throw something at full strength, whether that be a jutsu or something like a kunai or shuriken, and then managed to quickly outpace it. The only examples I could find were characters using the body flicker, reverse summoning, or some other movement speed hack, like Tobirama, Minato, Shisui, maybe Obito, possibly other characters around the Six Paths level, basically people who can teleport. But as for statements showing characters physically outrunning their own jutsu, I couldn't really find any. Let me know if you can think of any examples. I'd genuinely be curious to know if I missed something here. Interestingly, as an aside, some of the characters who are known for having crazy speed feats are melee fighters, whose most powerful attacks are all pretty much taijutsu based. We don't really see the 3rd and 4th Raikage using a lot of range attacks, right? Same goes for 8th Gate's Guy. When a character is presented as being fast enough to essentially teleport to their targets without using any hacks, they don't tend to rely on projectiles or ranged ninjutsu at all. Okay, now we can move on to the narrative arguments about the Rasen Shuriken's speed. Let's start with the claim that Naruto threw the Rasen Shuriken even though it was slower because he thought it would hit. Hopefully this should be obvious, but simply thinking it would hit in and of itself is a non sequitur. The fact that a character expects their attack to land isn't any kind of measurement of that attack's actual speed. Even if Naruto thinks he's won, even if he thinks his opponent is in a disadvantageous position, he often uses strategies with multiple layers, just in case something goes wrong that he wasn't expecting. For example, later in the same fight, Naruto throws the second Rasen Shuriken after he grabs the Preta Path, and we get a thought bubble where he says they shouldn't be able to dodge it. He thought the Rasen Shuriken was going to hit here, and he probably expects that it has the AP to take them out based on how it sliced through the human path earlier. Despite all that, he still has his clone come in with the Rasengan and take out the Naraka path. He's not really doing anything that complex when throwing the Rasen Shuriken at inconvenienced Tendo here, but the suggestion that he would throw a slow Rasen Shuriken at Pain just because he's currently on the ground, rather than running in for the kill if it's truly faster, it just doesn't make sense when you consider how Naruto approaches his fights. When Pain is about to kill Kakashi with the nail, he knows he's got him dead to rights, he's wounded, and he's out of chakra. He's completely covered in rubble and pinned down. And despite that fact, Pain, who is clearly way stronger than Kakashi and has every advantage in the situation, decides to Shinra Tensei the nail at him and specifically says, "I'm not taking any chances." And on the other hand, when Kakashi was up against Deidara in chapter 278, at the end of that fight, Deidara had no clay, no chakra, no fucking arms, and was exhausted, and Kakashi and Naruto himself still approached him cautiously. With all the crazy jutsu, traps, illusions, feints, and other such attacks involved in shinobi battles in this universe, it's usually a pretty bad idea to assume your opponent doesn't have a hidden ace up their sleeve, or something like a trap that you trigger by closing ranks with them. So you could argue that Naruto threw the Rasen Shuriken because maintaining the distance from Pain was the wiser tactical choice. But you could also argue that if the Shuriken is slower than Naruto, throwing it gives Pain more time to react. Katsuyu had also mentioned that Pain hasn't shown his full abilities, and those abilities might be temporarily unavailable. Naruto is thus incentivized to wipe Pain out completely before those abilities return, so using a jutsu that's slower than himself just doesn't make any sense. Again, this is all kind of speculative, isn't it? None of this discussion gives us any tangible data about the actual speed of the Shuriken, but the narrative suggestion that he would actively choose to throw a slow Shuriken doesn't work here. If you scroll through the comments section of the debate video, you'll notice a number of people mentioning how difficult it was to sit through what they referred to as the recoil arguments. Well, here they are. Noodles' argument here is essentially that even if the Rasen Shuriken is slower than he is, Naruto might choose to throw it anyway because it might damage him if he uses it in close quarters. It is true that when Naruto used the Rasen Shuriken in melee against Kakuzu, his arm was broken after the fight. Remember, he was so injured he couldn't properly feed himself afterwards. And Tsunade wanted Kakashi to tell Naruto not to ever use the Rasen Shuriken ever again because she detected cellular damage and Keirakuke damage in Naruto's arm and hand. As a quick reminder, the Keirakuke is the network of channels and nodes that chakra flows through in a shinobi's body. In response to that, Swag points to a databook statement that says Naruto's body toughened up by the time he achieved Sage Mode, and that with that tougher body, the damage from using the Rasen Shuriken in melee, which Swag refers to as recoil damage, is no longer a factor. So from that point onward, Naruto can use the Rasen Shuriken in melee without ever worrying about taking the sort of recoil damage he took when he used it against Kakuzu. To summarize, Noodles is saying that Naruto threw the Rasen Shuriken even though it's slower than him to avoid that recoil damage, but Swag replies that that argument doesn't work because recoil damage is no longer a factor by the time of the Naruto vs. Pain fight since Naruto's body has gotten tougher. Okay, so what's going on here? Why was this such a sticking point? Well, there's some confusion about how the Rasen Shuriken works and when and how Naruto takes damage from it. Essentially, Noodles was unable to understand the difference between the recoil damage Naruto took when he hit Kakuzu and the damage that Kakuzu took from the huge explosion that wound up killing 2 of his hearts. To clear up this confusion, we need to take a second and break down how this jutsu works at a basic level. The Rasen shuriken essentially has 3 stages that it goes through when it's used. The first stage we can call the prep stage. This is just when Naruto molds and shapes the chakra for the jutsu, and then holds it ready in his hand. And this state alone probably causes some strain to Naruto's hand and arm, at least when he's in base mode. The second stage of the Rasen shuriken is when it makes physical contact with an enemy. This can either be when Naruto throws it at an enemy and it connects, or when he thrusts the Rasen shuriken into an enemy at close range, like he did with Kakuzu. What's important to notice about this stage is that the shuriken doesn't immediately explode on contact. It starts to unwind and rev up as it gathers momentum, and in this stage, it can push its targets back a good distance, carrying them away from Naruto. This is exactly what happens to Kakuzu after Naruto makes contact in their fight. He's essentially rocketed to the other side of the battlefield. When he's in base, Naruto takes damage to his hand and arm when he makes contact with the enemy in this phase, probably as a result of this initial burst of energy. And then finally, there's a massive explosion as the Rasen shuriken fully detonates. This is where the bulk of the damage from the jutsu is dealt, and this is what ultimately kills 2 of Kakuzu's hearts. It's important to note that in the Kakuzu fight, Naruto is nowhere near the blast radius when this explosion goes off, since remember, Kakuzu was propelled far away from Naruto during the contact stage. Putting that all together, when Naruto is in base, his hand likely takes strain from readying the Rasen shuriken, and his hand and arm take recoil damage if he uses the jutsu in melee. If he were ever caught up in that main explosion, he would also take massive damage and possibly even die. But by the time he achieves Sage Mode, Naruto's body is much tougher, so when he readies the jutsu, he no longer takes damage to his hand. If he uses the jutsu in close range, he no longer takes recoil damage either. However, if he got caught up in the main explosion, he would probably still take heavy damage. That final blast is discharging way more power and energy than the initial contact does. When we put that all together, Naruto does not need to worry about recoil damage during the pain fight, and he also doesn't need to worry about getting caught in the main blast, so the suggestion that the Rasen shuriken is slower than he is but he's throwing it anyway to avoid getting hurt by it does not hold up. To elaborate, Naruto never gets caught in the Rasen shuriken's main explosion throughout the entire series. For an example, let's take a look at the fight against Kurama in the Sanctuary in chapter 497. Naruto chucks the Rasen shuriken at Kurama at close range and manages to easily stay out of the range of the explosion. And then later in 499, the Rasen shuriken manages to push Kurama back out of his own chakra while he's being held back by Kushina's chains. Even when it doesn't propel his enemies back quite as far, like during his fight against the Third Raikage, Naruto is still easily able to maneuver outside of the blast radius and avoid taking damage. Actually, it's not just the Rasen shuriken that can propel its enemies back, the base Rasengan can do the same thing. Going back to part 1, the very first time we see the Rasengan is when Jiraiya uses it on that mobster during the search for Tsunade, and it sends the mobster flying. We see the same thing happening in the pain fight as well. When Naruto slams the Deva Path with it at the end of the fight, the Deva Path gets blown back and slams into the rocks behind him. All of this just goes to show that Naruto doesn't have to worry about getting caught up in the main explosion because the jutsu pushes his enemies back. If you're wondering why I said that Naruto would take damage from just preparing and readying the jutsu, let's take a quick look back at chapter 152. At this point in the story, Naruto's been training to learn the base Rasengan, and while he's still struggling with the first stage of the training, Naruto's hand gets sore and starts to seize up and ache. It keeps on hurting even after he's taken a break from training, and we know how exceptional Naruto's healing factor is, so the damage here is significant to say the least. Jiraiya even says that the Rasengan is taking its toll on Naruto's Kerakuke, and Naruto later describes it as, "Every time I let my chakra flow, it's like my nerves are getting stabbed and pain shoots down my arms and hands. The more I increase the volume of chakra flow, the worse the pain." Alright, now hopefully you should understand the Rasen shuriken and how and why it damages its user a bit more clearly. So now that we've gone through all that together, before we move on to the next section, what I want you to do now is to completely forget about everything I just said because none of it fucking matters at all. The only reason we're even talking about any of this in the first place is because Noodles thinks that Naruto would throw the Rasen shuriken, even though it's slower than he is, to avoid having his arm get hurt by it, and this is where I started to wonder if Noodles has been reading the same version of Naruto that I read, because this kid right here, is not going to stop using a jutsu just because it might rough him up a bit. Even if Naruto shattered his arm to splinters every time he used the Rasen shuriken, it wouldn't stop him. Just like the risks to using the 8 gates don't stop Lee or Guy, the risks of the soldier pills don't stop Choji, and the consequences of mitotic regeneration don't stop Tsunade. Saying that Naruto flat out would not use the Rasen shuriken in melee against Pain, the person who killed Jiraiya, killed Kakashi, destroyed his village, and is now threatening the lives of all his friends and comrades, makes zero sense with what we know about Naruto as a character. We could go over so many examples of how Naruto doesn't hesitate to put himself directly in harm's way when it comes to defending his friends. But I want to highlight one here because there's a direct parallel between this example and the Pain fight. Remember back in part 1 where Naruto was facing off against Orochimaru and Kabuto after they'd just taken down Tsunade? Naruto throws himself in front of Tsunade to protect her from Kabuto, literally head first. After trying the Rasengan out on Kabuto once and missing, Naruto then lets Kabuto shove a kunai right through his hand and then drives it in further and locks onto it in order to give himself an opportunity to use the Rasengan again in close range. I want to repeat that. He let the enemy slice through his hand to give himself an opportunity to use a Rasengan. Back in the Pain fight, Naruto is once again facing a superior enemy who is threatening to kill Tsunade, and he begins his fight by jumping in to save her with a Rasengan. Later in the fight, when Naruto has just re-entered Sage Mode, and the Deva path is down on the ground and all the other paths are either defeated or out of the way, Naruto now has an opening to end the fight then and there. If the Rasen Shuriken really does move more slowly than Naruto, in other words, if it would be faster for Naruto to just dash in and use it in melee, like he did on Kakazu, let me ask you this. Do you really think this kid is going to pass up an opportunity to end the fight right here and now because he'd be worried about hurting his arm? Are you really going to argue that this kid is going to just hang back and play it safe? I want to go back to Naruto's conversation with Haku back in part 1. This is a pivotal moment for Naruto's character development. We see Haku inspire Naruto to seek strength by defending others, and to not be afraid to put himself in harm's way to save people he cares about. We actually have a beautiful page illustrating how other people, important to Naruto, have rushed in risking their own flesh to save people important to them. This moment, this conversation with Haku, becomes a cornerstone of Naruto's Nindo. Throughout his entire life, Naruto is repeatedly shown how risking life and limb in defense of the people and ideals you cherish is where true strength comes from. He's grown up alongside people like Lee, who puts this principle into practice in every fight, regardless of the injuries he sustains in the process. He's seen people like Hinata force themselves back onto their feet time and time again, even when they're at death's door, because they refuse to give up or to give in. With all that in mind, with all that being said, I'll ask this one more time. Even if using the Rasen Shuriken in close quarters meant that Naruto would break every single bone in his body, do you think that would actually stop him from using a melee Rasen Shuriken on Pain if he thought doing so would end the fight and save the lives of his fellow villagers? I can actually just answer this question directly. Just before the Pain fight, Tsunade tells Kakashi about the risks of the Rasen Shuriken, about how she's detected cellular damage in Naruto's hands and arm, and asks Kakashi to warn Naruto to never use it again. Remember, Naruto's arm is injured to the point where he can't even feed himself after using the Rasen Shuriken on Kakazu, and when Kakashi starts to try to tell him not to use the jutsu again, Naruto cuts him off and says that he alone knows the limits of his own body, shutting Kakashi down and confirming that he's never going to let the potential risks stand in his way. If I managed to accomplish one thing with this video, I want it to be the dismantling, once and for all, the idea that Naruto is some kind of idiot with poor battle intelligence. I'm honestly baffled that this keeps coming up. Naruto has tons of strong battle intelligence feats spanning from part 1 through to the end of the series, but it's come up in multiple debates now over the course of multiple years, and it just needs to die. It represents a completely broken view of Naruto as a character, and of the fights in the series in general. Let me explain. To be specific, I'm addressing Noodle's argument that Naruto might throw the Rasen Shuriken at Tendo when Tendo is lying on the ground, even though it's slower, even though he wouldn't take recoil damage from running up and using it at point blank, because, quote, Naruto can be kind of a dumbass and probably wasn't thinking about speed. He specifically says, you can't prove that Naruto has good battle intelligence. But we can totally prove this. It's not that hard at all. Naruto is not stupid, Naruto is not a dumbass, Naruto isn't book smart, but that doesn't mean he's not battle smart. Naruto is extremely sharp when it comes to formulating battle strategies. He struggles with book learning, but when academic knowledge is presented with a visual metaphor, or he has a chance to learn through action, he grasps those same concepts extremely quickly. Here's a great example. Naruto initially struggles to understand the mechanics of Sage Mode, but instantly gets it when Gamakichi uses his mint ice cream swirl analogy. Naruto does occasionally make mistakes, but when he does, he quickly realizes what they are and adjusts his strategy accordingly, which is a sign of intelligence. Making a mistake isn't a sign of low intelligence, but identifying the problem, responding to it quickly, and adapting to the situation with an effective solution is a sign of high intelligence. And that's what Naruto shows time and time again. Now, it's true, due to his brash and impetuous nature, Naruto sometimes does goofy shit, especially while he's still a kid or when he loses his temper, which often involves him bragging and revealing his position, or just charging headlong into danger. For examples of this, we could look at when he jumps straight into Haku's ice mirrors in part 1, or the time he freaks out at Deidara during the Gaara rescue mission, but that sort of thing does not somehow negate all the extremely clever stuff he does elsewhere throughout the series. Noodles brings up two pieces of evidence to support his Naruto is a dumbass hypothesis. The first one is that Naruto forgets about Edo Nagato's absorption ability, and the second is that Naruto later forgets about Obito's invulnerability to all non-sage jutsu. Noodles' argument is that since Naruto made mistakes in these two instances, he's dumb enough that he might be making a mistake in the pain fight as well, the mistake being choosing to throw the Rasen shuriken even though it's slower. Three main problems here. Firstly, the fact that Naruto did make mistakes in other fights doesn't necessarily mean he's making a mistake here. Next, the nature of the mistakes we're talking about are totally different. Swag actually kind of points this out. In the Nagato and Obito examples, Naruto is stumbling over the fact that his opponents can negate jutsu, which is a pretty rare and exceptional ability. The fact that he momentarily struggles to retain that concept does not imply that he would somehow be oblivious to a glaring flaw in his own jutsu, in other words, that he wouldn't understand the Rasen shuriken being slower than himself. For context, remember, Naruto's been training every single night with the Rasen shuriken before the pain fight. He's developing it as a new super strength jutsu specifically to kill pain with. He knows the jutsu's strengths and limitations intimately because he, himself, invented the jutsu. The level of obliviousness it would take for him to disregard its crippling disadvantage, it being slower than him, in the middle of a fight against the person he designed it to defeat, is in a completely different league from momentarily forgetting that Edo Nagato can absorb jutsu. Anyway, regardless of all that, I'm just gonna straight up make the positive claim that Naruto has extremely high combat intelligence, and I'm actually gonna substantiate my claim with examples from the manga. And while we're at it, we're also gonna provide more evidence to show that Naruto wouldn't throw a slow Rasen shuriken just because he thought it would hit. Now, the right thing to do here would be to reread the entire manga and go through every single fight and look for examples of Naruto being tactically smart and compile them here. That would obviously be tedious, laborious, time-consuming, and tiresome, and we're gonna do it anyway. Like I said before, this argument needs to go away permanently, and I'm not above going through the entire series to support my position. Let's go. We'll start off with one of my favorite fights in the whole series. In Chapter 14, Sasuke and Naruto are in their first real combat mission, facing off against Zabuza, who is clearly a superior opponent. Naruto himself formulates a strategy using his shadow clone bait into a transformation shadow shuriken feint that he communicates implicitly with Sasuke, which gives them the opportunity to break Kakashi free of Zabuza's prison jutsu. This happens on his first real mission when he's a child. In Chapter 62, Naruto is fighting off a swarm of enemies conjured by a Genjutsu. Initially, it looks like he just blindly rushes in at the enemies, but he's actually using this as a distraction to create transformed clones of himself and his teammates, so they can all hide and then draw out the enemy. Naruto comes up with this strategy in the heat of the moment and gets his team a win against a superior opponent. In Chapter 75, Naruto manages to trick Kiba, arguably a stronger and faster opponent, into mistaking him for his own dog, and manages to not wound Akamaru in the process. Kankuro and Temari, who had up until recently regarded Naruto as just some doofus, say, "I had no idea he was so good, he timed his tricks flawlessly." Then Kiba begins to overwhelm him, and while being pressured, Naruto tricks Kiba by transforming into Kiba himself. He then deliberately lets himself get hit, maintains his composure, and transforms into Akamaru, baiting Kiba into hitting his own dog. Honestly, this right here is all I really need to demonstrate that Naruto has high battle intelligence, This is some borderline Shikamaru level strategy here, but we're really just getting started. In his fight against Neji, Naruto recalls how Neji's Tenketsu blocking attacks work. See, he is able to recall technical battle details from previous fights. He then baits Neji into attacking the wrong Shadow Clone by pretending to hang back. Neji says, in reaction to this, he anticipated my thoughts and deliberately steered me towards one of his clones. Later, even though Naruto gets a boost from the Ninetales chakra, that's not what wins him the fight. It's him taking the time to prepare and burrow a Shadow Clone underground, which is what lets him land the decisive blow on Neji. Naruto also says, from the start I came into this match fully prepared to lose. This is another bit of evidence to demonstrate both that Naruto doesn't just assume a fight is won because he can land a hit, and that he's not afraid to take serious punishment in order to win a fight or even just to land a serious blow. In Chapter 133, during his fight with Gaara, Naruto uses his Shadow Clones in this innovative and complex way to create platforms in midair and increase his maneuverability. Then he uses the 1,000 Years of Death, essentially a joke move that he'd only seen one time before, to exploit pretty much the one weakness in Gaara's defenses at the time. This is played up for laughs, but it's also calculated, crafty, and cunning. It's also risky, since the kunai he uses has a paper bomb attached to it, and he's at risk of getting blown back or at least getting caught up in the explosion. Notice how the risk of taking damage from an explosion at close range doesn't stop him here. We've talked about the Kabuto fight already, but as a recap, in Chapter 165, Naruto is up against a stronger, more experienced, and more deadly opponent. His leg is fractured and he's taken a beating. Kabuto underestimates him and taunts him. Naruto exploits this, grabs his kunai to root him in place, and then uses a new version of the Rasengan unique to him, all in the heat of the moment. Naruto is able to adapt, take advantage of his opponent's arrogance, and improvise a new version of a jutsu that he's still actively learning how to use while under pressure and in combat. In Chapter 192, Naruto uses multiple Shadow Clones to trick Kidomaru and buy time, once again exploiting his opponent's low expectations. Kidomaru even says, "I can't believe a scumbag like him planned something this complicated." In Chapter 247, Naruto and Sakura have their bell test rematch with Kakashi. This is comedic, but think about what Naruto actually pulled off here. He manages to break a stalemate and get the win against a superior opponent by exploiting a weakness unique to that opponent. He also covers his bases by using a strategy that forces Kakashi to cover his ears and thwart the Sharingan all in one fell swoop. In Chapter 260, Naruto immediately intuits Kakashi's strategy after Itachi uses his Fireball Jutsu, and he's ready to use his Rasengan at a moment's notice to blow through the clone. Naruto gets the win on the imposter Itachi. In Chapter 264, Naruto does initially charge in recklessly when he's infuriated after learning that Gaara's been killed, but moments later he cools down and regroups with Kakashi and manages to rescue Gaara after the fact. See, even when he makes mistakes, he quickly acknowledges this, grows, and adapts. If Naruto had actually made an error after throwing the Rasen shuriken, it would have been in character for him to acknowledge that and adjust his strategy. And now for the Kakuzu fight. Noodles claimed in his last debate with Swag, and repeats here again, that the only reason Naruto won against Kakuzu is that he got lucky and acted unpredictably. No. What Naruto did was another iteration of what he's been doing up to this point in the series. He faced an opponent who was much older and more experienced than himself, with a much higher body count. He used Shadow Clones to study his opponent's strengths, speed, and combat style. He incorporated the knowledge from those Shadow Clones into an attack that would have killed Kakuzu immediately had the Rasen Shuriken not fizzled out. Then, he adjusted his strategy and baited his opponent into underestimating him for a second time in a row. Kakuzu goes for the decoy because he assumes Naruto would have been stupid enough to do the same thing twice. Naruto anticipates this and uses a decoy to create an opening and get the win. And regarding this statement that Naruto is unpredictable, yeah, he's referred to that way in the series and in the data books. But that doesn't mean he has completely illegible attack patterns that are just impossible to read and respond to. It means that he constantly surpasses expectations and surprises both his opponents and his comrades by coming up with innovative jutsu and maneuvers. He's not drunken boxing Lee, he's not blades out Killer Bee, he's not flailing around in some completely incomprehensible way. Like the mythological fox spirit he's partially inspired by, Naruto is crafty and cunning and wins his fights using clever tactics. The one exception I can think of in part 1 is the forbidden wind jutsu that he uses against Kiba. But that sort of thing happens very rarely, and it's also not even what wins him that fight. I also want to address the claim that Noodles made in his previous debate with Swag that Naruto only beat Kakuzu because he caught him off guard. In order to catch an opponent off guard in the middle of a fight when your opponent is focused on you and aiming to kill you, you need to create and exploit an opening in which to catch them off guard in the first place, which requires strategy and battle intelligence. I'll also point out that both the Rasen Shuriken and the use of shadow clones as a battle simulation to gain intel on an opponent before engaging them in full are tactics that Naruto is using for the first time ever in this battle, and he uses them effectively and scores a victory. Next up is the Pain fight. Let's skip ahead to the third time Naruto uses a Rasen Shuriken on Pain. Here, Naruto quickly develops and executes a multi-stage plan with multiple contingencies. An initial Shadow Rasen Shuriken transformation into a body tackle to disable Preta, which is effective. A second actual Rasen Shuriken to try to take out Tendo, which fails to take him out but still forces Tendo to use a Shinra Tensei and puts him on cooldown. And then a final attack with Rasengan targeted at the Naraka path, which takes it out. In one fell swoop, Naruto managed to disable a path that absorbed all ninjutsu, destroy the most tactically significant enemy on the field, and distract the other active path all at once. Low battle intelligence? No, not even in this fight. He actually has another intelligence feat in this fight as well. After the Chibaku Tensei collapses, Naruto makes a split-second decision to create and hide a small army of shadow clones among the rebel, once he realizes that his last Sage Mode clone has been released. He then uses a Shadow Shuriken and a Rasen Shuriken to bait Pain into thinking he's out of chakra, and then goes in for a melee attack with the mass Shadow Clones. But he was planning ahead in case this failed as well, as we see him prepping more Shadow Clones to catch him. He then gets Pain with the Rasengan, not through sheer force, but by using this multi-stage tactical maneuver, which, and we talked about this before, culminates in him throwing himself at Tendo Pain. Remember, he's trying to get to Tendo as fast as possible, and he chooses to throw himself rather than to run over to him. In Naruto's fight with the third Raikage, an entire platoon of ninja, including Dodai and a bunch of Jonin-level characters with far more experience than Naruto himself, and with intel on the enemy they're fighting, have been completely unable to inflict meaningful damage on the Raikage whatsoever. Naruto alone notices the scar on his chest and figures out his one weakness, and devises the strategy to turn the Raikage's own attack against him. He also switches to Sage Mode, saying that it'll give him enough speed to dodge the Raikage, which is pretty clear evidence against the claim that Naruto doesn't consider speed in a fight. In Chapter 598 and throughout the fight with Obito, Naruto engages in a series of technical maneuvers with Guy and Kakashi to thwart Kamui, which is one of the most powerful and mechanically complex jutsu in the series. Chapter 639 actually gives us a more nuanced portrayal of Naruto's multiple intelligences. He's worried about the Hokage dying, and temporarily forgets that they're gonna regenerate all damage as Edo Tensei, so he's forgotten a technical detail. But then, in the next chapter, it's shown that he remembers that Minato can only teleport things he, himself, or his chakra are touching directly. He recalls this detail, makes a split-second call, and, as he's seconds away from Obito killing him and Sasuke, reaches out and connects to them with his chakra and saves both of their lives. Yes, he can occasionally forget things. He can also remember critical technical information and use it to make split-second maneuvers that get him and his comrades out of danger. And now we're finally at the Obito Senjutsu fight that Noodles mentioned, in Chapter 643. After Gamakichi's attack is effective against Obito, Naruto immediately notices and figures out the Senjutsu weakness before Obito himself does. He then immediately comes up with a strategy to test that weakness, silently communicates that strategy with Tobirama, and executes it to confirm his hypothesis, without showing Obito his hand. What's most telling is how Naruto explains this all a moment later. When Naruto goes into Sage Mode to gauge the Ten Tails' power, he notices that it's composed of nature energy. Then, after he sees Gamakichi's syrup gun have an effect on Obito's orbs, he figures out that Senjutsu is effective. Specifically, he says, "So maybe you can counter nature energy with nature energy, not that I really understand it." See, he is able to quickly intuit technical details about battle mechanics, but he doesn't necessarily understand the academic principles behind them, and that's where the misunderstanding about him being stupid comes from. It's also worth acknowledging that Naruto does temporarily forget about the Senjutsu weakness, but take a look at the context in which this happens. Naruto has just come up with and executed a plan with Minato to save the entire Shinobi Alliance from a blast from the Ten Tails. by teleporting them all outside the barrier. Again, he comes up with this in the heat of the moment under pressure, using technical information he just learned about how Minato and Kurama's chakra linking works. All of that, by the way, is another very impressive battle intelligence feat for Naruto. When he forgets about Obito's senjutsu weakness, it's right after pulling all of that off. Then he gets pumped up, lets out a vigorous shout as Tobirama puts it, and charges at Obito, and that's when he forgets about the senjutsu weakness. There's a lot going on in this scene, a lot of new and important information for Naruto to keep track of. The fact that he forgets one of those details is not an anti-feat for Naruto's intelligence overall, and it doesn't negate any of his recent strategic feats either. Naruto also quickly acknowledges his mistake and corrects it, just like he did with Nagato's jutsu absorption. I want us to think about how that applies to the pain fight as well. If Naruto had temporarily forgotten that his Rasen shuriken was slow, wouldn't he have commented on that and adjusted his strategy accordingly? He's demonstrated time and time again that he's able to notice deficits with his own attacks mid-battle and adjust and devise new strategies accordingly, including in the Nagato and Obito fights. If the shuriken's speed was a concern, he would have mentioned it and adapted accordingly. Also, when Naruto temporarily forgets that Nagato has chakra absorption, remember, he's never fought against Nagato's single body. Previously, the Paths of Pain could only use one kind of jutsu apiece. He's still figuring out that Nagato can not only use all of Pain's abilities, but also that he can use them all simultaneously, which he's never encountered before. And finally, yes, it's played for laughs, but the reverse harem jutsu on Kaguya is actually a stroke of genius. How do you counter the most powerful character in the entire verse to date, who can warp between dimensions and nullify any attack? You come up with a completely unorthodox tactic that surprises that opponent and gives you an opening. See, this is what Naruto being unpredictable really means, that he's consistently able to surprise and confuse his enemies by using unique and innovative strategies. That's not just some sort of cosmic dice roll, it's strategy, and it works because Naruto is smart. Okay, those are all the examples I wanted to talk about for this video. I haven't included every single fight in the series, and this is not to suggest that Naruto is only smart in the fights I've talked about, and is some kind of idiot in his other fights, just that he's not demonstrating his most impressive feats in those other fights. Like, for example, in his fight against Kimimaro, he's not necessarily being an idiot or anything in that fight, but he's also not strategizing with the same level of detail he does in some of his other matchups. So with all that being said, can we please, once and for all, retire the idea that Naruto is some kind of tactical idiot? And can we please understand and accept that multiple intelligences are a thing? If you're still unconvinced, I'm willing to do a deeper dive video where I'll analyze all of Naruto's fights and look even more closely at his tactical thinking, because this point needs to be hammered home. I'll even go so far as to say that if you don't understand this basic fact about Naruto as a fighter and as a character, it's essentially impossible for you to understand this series at all. I just fail to see how anyone can really understand or appreciate any of the fights that Naruto's in if they just fundamentally do not get this about his character. It affects your understanding of the entire series. For the record, Noodles, or anyone else watching, I hope you understand that there are multiple intelligences. I hope you haven't been on the receiving end of this kind of rhetoric. If someone told you you were a dumbass because your learning style is different from their expectations of what it means to be smart, they were wrong. Intelligence presents and manifests in many different ways, and it's still a subject that's not fully understood. Don't be down on yourselves or on others because you think differently. Okay, time for a palate cleanser. Let's talk about the Chibaku Tensei. The debaters disagreed on whether the Chibaku Tensei would be effective on Itachi or Sage Naruto. Specifically, Noodles claimed that the Chibaku Tensei would be ineffective against Itachi because Pain couldn't even hold it up for any amount of time, which implies that the Chibaku Tensei needs to be actively held up by its users. This isn't really how the jutsu works though. There are actually a bunch of misconceptions about the Chibaku Tensei that come up in the debate, so let's clear them up first and then talk about whether or not it would be effective against Itachi. The Chibaku Tensei is specifically referred to in the databooks as a sealing jutsu. Its function is to trap and contain its targets. To quote the databooks directly, the jutsu transforms the sealing target into a gravitational core in the sky, attracting rock formations that bury it alive. Someone targeted by this jutsu could potentially be killed by it, but its main function is to imprison its targets and seal them away. So, a couple of things to note right off the bat. Note that the jutsu description says it attracts rock formations, and not that it sucks up everything around it. In other words, it doesn't suck up people. Going through all the uses of the Chibaku Tensei in the series, we never see it actually suck a person up into the gravity core. For some examples, in the Edo Nagato fight in chapter 551, Naruto, Bee, and Itachi are all standing on rocks as the rocks lift up. Itachi's robe is pulled up a little bit, but none of the characters themselves individually are physically lifted up off the rocks. And in chapter 676, when Madara creates a whole cluster of Chibaku Tenseis, we have characters nearby on the ground and they're not pulled up. Gaara and Lee are on the sand, and those characters don't get pulled up, and neither does the sand itself. Naruto says that these Chibaku Tensei, Madara's, individually are each bigger than the one the Pain made, and there are a lot more of them, but no one's physically getting pulled up towards them. As such, the jutsu is most effective against large targets, like the Biju or transformed Jinchuriki, whose larger forms can get overwhelmed by the masses of rocks coming at them from every direction. But for smaller human-sized targets, the Chibaku Tensei would arguably be far less effective. If they're not getting sucked up into the core, the characters would have an opportunity to just move out of range. In other words, I think Itachi could just jump off the rocks. He could just pop up his Susanoo and walk casually off screen while swatting away the flying chunks of earth that got in his way. I know we all want to think of the Chibaku Tensei as this ultimate fight-ending ability, but I think the truth is it was never really meant to be used on small targets. The real danger to small targets comes from the impact damage they might take from getting pelted with or crushed by falling boulders. But as for the gravity core itself, it's not some inescapable vacuum that sucks up everything in the vicinity. Six-Tails Naruto got caught up in it because he was rampaging, and his larger body got wedged between a couple of the rock slabs, and the rocks themselves rose up. But would the same thing happen to Itachi? I honestly don't think so. On the other hand, the argument that Nagato couldn't hold up the Chibaku Tensei is just nonsense, because it implies that Nagato needs to keep spending chakra or effort to keep focusing on the sphere after it's complete, which is not how the ability works. Remember, it's a sealing jutsu designed to imprison its targets. Would it really make sense for a prison like that to require a constant stream of chakra and mental focus from its creator in order to keep it together, like a Naruto version of the doors in Five Nights at Freddy's where you have to keep spending power to keep the doors closed? I can answer that directly by referencing Sasuke's use of the Chibaku Tensei later in the series. Remember, he imprisons all the Biju in Chibaku Tensei and then goes off to fight Naruto. During that fight, Sasuke runs out of chakra, passes out, and wakes up the next day, and the Chibaku Tensei, with all the Biju in them, are still active. It's only after Naruto and Sasuke make the hand sign together that the jutsu is released, and the spheres all crumble and fall apart at that point. Sasuke is drained of energy and unconscious, and the Chibaku Tensei spheres all stay together, so they don't require chakra or active effort to be maintained. I mean, just think of the ones made to seal Kaguya and the Ten Tails. They are some of the greatest threats the world has ever experienced. Putting them in prisons that are eventually just going to crumble and fall apart if no one's paying attention to them and feeding them chakra actively would be pretty silly. Okay, so if the Chibaku Tensei doesn't need to be held up, then why did Pain seem to drop it during the Pain vs. Naruto fight? Noodles points to this sequence of events after Sage Naruto exits the Chibaku Tensei, where Nagato falls to the side, coughs up blood, and then the Chibaku Tensei falls from the sky. And I agree, at first glance, it does look like it's falling as a direct consequence of Nagato collapsing, but we're missing some context. When Nagato first captures Naruto inside the Chibaku Tensei, he says, "Nine Tails capture complete," and lowers his arms. We don't get any further statements from him, or from Konan, indicating that he's continuing to exert himself at this point. Remember, Nagato's goal is to capture Naruto alive and bring him back to the Gedo statue to extract the Nine Tails chakra, so Pain saying the capture operation is complete here indicates that he thinks Naruto is sealed away within the sphere. At this point, if nothing else happens, the jutsu is complete and Nagato doesn't need to put any more chakra into it to keep it afloat. Then, Naruto breaks out of the Chibaku Tensei with his Eight Tails transformation, causing massive damage to the outside of the sphere. In addition to just disrupting the overall shape and consistency of the sphere, we know from Itachi's analysis during the Edo Nagato fight that the gravity core is a weak point and can be damaged. There's a good chance Naruto thrashing around in there may have clipped the core, which would further destabilize it. Regardless, with Naruto having broken out, it's clearly no longer an effective prison, and any sealing effect on Naruto is also clearly broken at that point. After all that, Pain has Tendo raise his hands and says, "I should enlarge ... This indicates that Nagato is now going to resume interacting with the Chibaku Tensei. He needs to re-establish a connection with it, so to speak, to be able to repair and enlarge the sphere. Once Naruto changes back into Sage Mode, it looks like Nagato is preparing to engage with the Chibaku Tensei again, and then he falls over, exhausted and coughing up blood. We see something like a tremor that causes the Chibaku Tensei to shake, and then it falls from the sky. So the reason it falls is not because Nagato had to stand there holding it up the whole time and then just ran out of chakra. The reason it falls is because Naruto damaged and destabilized the core, and when Nagato tried to repair it, his body gave out and he disrupted it further, causing it to fall. Or you could interpret it as Nagato was holding up the broken sphere, like once he raises his arms and says, "I should enlarge," he starts holding it up in that moment and then drops it. Either way, the point is, he does not need to physically hold up the completed sealed sphere. That's not how it works. He only needs to actively hold it up if it's broken or incomplete. Okay, so how does any of that relate to Itachi? Well, if Pain can trap Itachi inside the Chibaku Tensei and a complete sphere is formed, Itachi would be sealed inside. If that seal is maintained, then Pain doesn't have to keep spending chakra and stamina to keep it up. It'll just hover there in midair, so Pain effectively gets the win. However, Pain would need to actually trap Itachi in the sphere in the first place. As long as Itachi is able to run out of range of the gravity core, he should be good. If he does get caught up in the core, like if he's in his Susanoo and it starts getting swarmed with rocks, I think a battle of attrition would begin between him and Pain, where Itachi would try to damage the rocks with the Totsuka blade, try to send some Yasaka Magatama into the gravity core, stuff like that, and as he keeps on damaging the Chibaku Tensei, Pain would keep spending more effort to fix it and make it larger, and it would come down to which one of them ran out of stamina first. As for whether Itachi's Susanoo could damage the Chibaku Tensei sphere, well, Sasuke's incomplete Susanoo was strong enough to cut through all those stone pillars at the 5 Kage summit in one swing. I think it's fair to assume that Itachi's would be even stronger, especially with the Totsuka blade, so Itachi should be able to cut through and bisect the rocks, but when Six Tails Naruto blasts the rocks with the chakra cannon, we see that chunks of rock get blasted away from the main sphere, but then they hover in midair for a second, reverse course, and slam right back into the sphere, meaning that Six Tails Naruto didn't effectively damage the sphere at all. So Itachi just slicing through the rocks might not do any good. He'd have to actually connect with the core in the center, so he'd potentially have a short window of time to try to blow it up from a distance before he gets overwhelmed. And even if he did destroy it, he'd still have the massive rocks crashing down on him from above to deal with. Between the Yatamura and the Susanoo itself, I don't think the rocks would damage him per se, but they'd still present an obstacle for him to deal with. To be fair though, we should also keep in mind that Pain was heavily fatigued before he used the Chibaku Tensei against Naruto, with the massive Shinra Tensei alone having caused him internal damage. So depending on how you think the fight goes down between Itachi and Pain, Pain could potentially make a much larger sphere and have much more stamina available to keep repairing and enlarging it as needed. But on the other hand, Itachi only unveils his Susanoo in the Sasuke fight when he's already heavily damaged and fatigued as well, and he still keeps it active for a long time. So I'm sure a fresh Itachi would be able to keep it up for longer as well. When we put all that together, I think it's fair to say the following. The Chibaku Tensei wouldn't immediately destroy the Susanoo or completely incapacitate Itachi either. However, it could still present a threat and an obstacle that Itachi would have to respond to correctly to avoid taking damage. It could force Itachi to allocate more chakra towards swatting away the debris with the Sword of Totsuka, or trying to disrupt the core with the Yasaka Magatama. In other words, I think Pain could potentially use it effectively, but doing so wouldn't land him an instant victory. It would likely at least pressure Itachi, but to what extent it's hard to say, and it would be risky for Pain as well, so it would need to be used intelligently to be effective. Oh, and just for fun, what do you think would happen if Pain just chucked the gravity core at Itachi's head? We always see the Chibaku Tensei being thrown up into the air, but what would happen if Nagato just decked him right in the face with it, and all the weight of the earth slabs just piled on top of him, instead of having to be sucked up into the sky? I hesitated to bring up Boruto at all because that is technically a separate series, but I found a couple of clips of Boruto-era Sasuke using his Chibaku Tensei in the way I'm talking about. I don't know for sure if this means Pain could do this to Itachi instead of using the massive satellite version, but if he could use Itachi himself as the locus of the gravity core, it would definitely make things more interesting. Before we wrap up this section, I want to quickly address Swag's claim that the Chibaku Tensei's upper limit is the equivalent of 3 full-strength attacks from Naruto and Itachi combined. I covered this in my other video, but a quick summary here. It's just that the fact that 3 attacks did destroy the Chibaku Tensei doesn't mean that all 3 were necessary. We don't know the exact AP of each individual jutsu comparatively. We don't know if, say, just B and Naruto's attacks would have been enough to destroy it, or Naruto and Itachi's, or even Itachi's on his own. To put it this way, let's say the Chibaku Tensei has 100 HP. B's attack does 50 damage, Itachi does 50, and Naruto's does 50 as well. Combined, they did 150 damage. But if we use Swag's line of reasoning here, we would incorrectly conclude that the Chibaku Tensei's HP is around 150 when it's actually 100. In other words, we have no idea how much overkill may be happening here. I do agree with Swag that the narrative implication is that it takes all 3, but since we don't know the details of how much damage was done by each jutsu, we can't fairly say that we know the ability's upper limit with certainty. Okay, this is a sensitive subject, so feel free to skip ahead to the next section if this stuff is uncomfortable for you in any way. I just wanted to make a point to address this because suicidal ideation and suicidality are serious issues that, hopefully obviously, can devastatingly affect people's lives. I feel that if you're going to use language like this, you should be careful and deliberate in doing so. Saying that Naruto was suicidal or that he was actively trying to commit suicide is callous at best. I think it's totally fair to look at his conversation with the Ninetales and his spiraling into despair, hopelessness, and rage as a metaphor for suicidal ideation. You could certainly draw a parallel between what Naruto's going through and what people experiencing suicidality, depression, and similar challenges might experience, but phrasing it as he was, quote, trying to commit suicide, like it was something he was deliberately and actively trying to achieve, is missing the entire point of the scene, and it comes across as pretty naive and insensitive towards people dealing with this stuff in real life. Thematically, Naruto is facing a choice here. He's considering a Faustian bargain with the Ninetales. He's being tempted with the offer of surrendering not just himself, but the moral principles, values, and the very way of life he's cultivated up to this point. Everything his mentors and heroes have taught him is being tested as he grapples with Pain's dilemma. Looking at all of that and just reductively summarizing it as he was committing suicide is pretty weak. He's not actively trying to kill himself, he is wrestling with an extreme emotional burden and being tempted with the power of the Ninetales' manipulation, the Ninetales being a symbol of wrath and destruction. He isn't trying to commit suicide, he's fighting to regain his sense of self and tragically losing just before Minato shows up, but fighting nonetheless. Look, I don't mean to be harsh, but this bothers me in particular because of how this statement ignores the genuinely compelling and heart-wrenching emotional context of the scene. It's almost as misguided as trying to have a power-scaling debate about Naruto versus his dark half at the Waterfall of Truth. This series is about more than just the technicalities and semantics of battles. And with that being said, let's dive right into another deep discussion of technical battle semantics. So before the fight, Naruto made 2 shadow clones, left them at Mount Myoboku, and had them build up Sage Chakra or store natural energy. When a clone with Sage Chakra is released, all the Sage Chakra the clone had been storing is transferred over to Naruto. Normally, Naruto can only use Sage mode for a short period, and regaining Senjutsu Chakra mid-battle is a no-go, since he has to be completely still for a time to do so. Using the Sage clones as batteries or chakra potions helps him get around that problem. However, there's a limit to how much Sage Chakra he can harbor inside himself at any given time. So if he accidentally releases both clones, he'll just wind up wasting all the excess chakra. And if he does things in general that agitate his chakra, he'll also agitate the clones, preventing them from accumulating chakra or possibly even releasing them too soon. So when Naruto enters the Ninetales state, his chakra, as he says, becomes agitated, and as a result, he's no longer able to maintain the shadow clone that he left up on the mountain. When this happens, all the Senjutsu chakra that the clone had been storing up is then transferred to Naruto, just like it was when he released the one that Fukasaku summoned earlier in the fight. So yes, the clone was quote-unquote lost, but its chakra wasn't wasted. Naruto still gets all that chakra back, which is why he leaves the Chibaku Tensei in Sage mode. As for whether or not Minato gives Naruto some chakra back, like Swag mentioned, I couldn't find any direct references to that happening. When Naruto exits the Chibaku Tensei, he's in Sage mode because of the Senjutsu chakra he got from his own clone. If anything, Minato actually inhibits Naruto's available chakra pool when he repairs the seal on the Ninetales. So, did Naruto blitz the Asura path? Arguably yes, but let's be clear about what we mean by blitz. It seems like Naruto and the Asura path travel about the same distance in about the same time frame. Naruto is going from on top of the toads to Tsunade, and the Asura path is going from the other paths to Tsunade. Depending on the time you're looking at it, it looks like Asura might have traveled a little bit further, which might mean he's a little bit faster, but we don't know for sure when Naruto started moving, since he's off panel when Asura starts dashing forward. If Naruto waited till the last minute to move, that would make his feat more impressive. It's probably safe to say that they're around the same speed. Tendo is able to react to and block an attack from Sage Naruto at close range, for instance. This assumes, of course, that all the paths are relative in speed, which we can get into separately. But for now, if by blitzed we just mean that Naruto rushed at Asura and one-shot that path before it could react, then yes, he absolutely blitzed him. Just keep in mind that Naruto's speed is partially adding together with Asura's speed for this feat, and the magnitude of the feat changes depending on when Naruto starts moving. This one is going to take a second. I need to address this notion that since Pain, quote, never did physical damage to Sage Naruto, that he would win in a straight up fight against Naruto overall. First of all, this is kind of silly because Sage Mode only lasts a short period of time, and once it's over with, Pain is able to completely dominate base Naruto and take him out of the fight in just a couple moves. Naruto does not have enough Sage Mode chakra to kill all the paths and the animal summons on his own. He ran out of Sage Chakra for the first time after only downing a couple of the paths, and that was with support, and he had to use a clone to get his Sage Mode Chakra back. Even if he could stay in Sage Mode for longer, Pain has demonstrated that he's very effective at taking Naruto out of Sage Mode with the Preta Path and Bansho Tenin. In fact, one Bansho Tenin, a punch, and a grab from Preta was all it took to immobilize Sage Naruto and just take him out of Sage Mode. And notice that Naruto doesn't get his Sage Chakra back either until he comes out of the Chibaku Tensei. He breaks free of Preta by overloading him with nature energy, and then breaking free of his grasp when he turns to stone, but he doesn't actually go back into Sage Mode after that, until his last Shadow Clone is released towards the end of the fight. So without additional Senjutsu Sage Clone batteries, it doesn't matter at all that Tendo's punch didn't hurt him in Sage Mode, it doesn't matter at all that Naruto says you can't hurt me, and Tendo says Sage Mode's such a bother. All of that is just immediately invalidated when Sage Mode runs out and when Tendo disables it. Let's use an analogy to illustrate the problem with this interpretation. Let's say that Kakashi has some hypothetical shield jutsu, and this shield jutsu will nullify any and all damage as long as it's active for up to 1 minute. So now let's imagine Kakashi's fighting Pain. Pain throws out a bunch of powerful attacks at Kakashi, and of course Kakashi takes no damage because his shield is up. Then the shield runs out, and the moment it's down, Pain sends a nail through Kakashi's head with the Shinra Tensei, one-shots him, and kills him. If someone then asked you if you thought Kakashi could beat Pain in a fight, would you respond by saying, well, Pain never damaged Kakashi with his shield up, so Pain would lose? Hopefully you can spot the issue here. Look, if that clunky analogy isn't convincing, let's just go over the fight. A lot of these misguided statements come from just looking at parts of the fight out of context. So let's look at the statements in context. I think people forget just how much assistance Naruto has during the Pain fight, and also forget what a disadvantage Pain is at for the first major part of their exchange. So let's look at it together. First of all, when Naruto starts off the fight with Pain, Nagato has just used the massive Shinra Tensei. He's expended a huge amount of chakra, and his own body has taken damage. Tendo's abilities are down, and Konan mentions that the other paths are taking longer than usual to recover. Also, Sakura has just killed the giant centipede animal summon. We also never see the chameleon or crustacean summons used in the Konoha fight, and when the chameleon is used in the Nagato fight, funny enough, it's got a large bandage around its midsection where it was sliced in two, and one of its eyes is patched up, which might mean that it's temporarily out of commission when Naruto fights Pain in the series. When Naruto shows up, he does so while Pain is in this state, with Tendo's main abilities on cooldown, with Nagato damaged and or fatigued, with the other paths recovering, and recovering more slowly than usual, and with multiple animal summons unavailable. Naruto also shows up already in Sage Mode, and he has those two Shadow Clones building up Senjutsu Chakra for him as well. Along with him are Gamabunta, Gamahiro, Gamaken, Fukasaku, Shima, Gamakichi, several of whom have fought Pain before. Naruto also immediately gets access to Katsuyu, who gives him a bunch of useful intel from people who have actively been fighting Pain. Since the Deva Path's abilities are down, Nagato arranges the Pains into a defensive formation and sends out the Asura Path after Tsunade. Naruto intercepts and downs the Asura Path while it's dashing towards her. In other words, when Naruto takes out this path, it's actively accelerated towards another target, which wouldn't have been the case if Naruto were fighting solo. Next, the animal path sends out the rhino at Naruto. Naruto throws it away, but doesn't actually kill it. When the bull and the dog summons rush at him, Fukasaku and Shima help out by stunning them, which gives Naruto an opening to use the Rasengan and launch them up into the air. He doesn't actually kill any of these summons, and without Ma and Pa, he wouldn't have had that opening to launch them into the air either. Gamahiro and Gamaken are the ones who actually down the bull and dog summons, while Gamabunta tries to teach the dog to sit and stay. All of this would have obviously gone down differently if Naruto was on his own. Naruto then takes out the Preta path on his own. However, Katsuyu specifically tells him not to try to use ninjutsu, so his victory over Preta was achieved with assistance. Naruto does get a kill with the Rasen shuriken moments after, but remember, the Deva Path's abilities are still on cooldown. In the next beat, the dogs start to split up, and the toads provide Naruto with more assistance by keeping them off of him. It then takes Fukasaku, Shima, and Gamabunta's combined efforts to give Naruto an opening to take out the animal path, which he does inside Gamabunta's mouth. This is what finally takes out the dogs, Naruto working with multiple frogs. Bars. And after all that, Naruto is now out of Sage Chakra, he loses Sage Mode. If Tendo were at full power and wanted to kill him, he absolutely could in this instance, despite all the advantages Naruto has had up until this point. One Bancho Tenin, some Chakra Rods, and it'd be done. As Tendo starts going after Naruto here, Naruto still needs to rely on Gamabunta and Fukasaku again to distract Tendo and help him summon his Sage clone. Eventually, once Tendo's powers have finally been restored, Tendo immediately takes out all the large toads basically in one hit, and he's able to get rid of Fukasaku with a single Bancho Tenin. He's then able to pull in Naruto and negate his Sage mode with another Bancho Tenin. I think a lot of people have internalized this idea that Naruto just shows up and effortlessly sweeps the battlefield, taking the paths out one by one with zero difficulty. He does have powerful jutsu, he does land some awesome attacks that take out several paths, but he has a ton of prep, assistance, and intel, and his enemy is at a significant disadvantage. Now imagine how Naruto would do in the same setup, with a fresh 100% chakra pain, who hadn't used the massive Shinra Tensei, with no Tsunade as a distraction, with no toads to distract the animal summons, with no Ma and Pa to stun the animal summons, with no Pa to summon in his Sage clone, with no Gamabunta to help out numerous times throughout the fight. Does the fact that pain didn't physically harm Naruto in Sage mode have any bearing whatsoever on the outcome of the matchup? Okay, two minor things I want to mention before we move on. To clarify Swag's point about Naruto resisting the Chakra Rods, he's able to break the Chakra Rods in Taijutsu when in Sage mode, but when Pain pierces him with Chakra Rods and pins him to the ground, he's in base. He never resists the Chakra Rods in Sage mode. When he blows them off and gets rid of them, it's because he's undergoing the Ninetales transformation. And lastly, Noodles describes Pain as being agitated about Sage mode, claiming he says, "Sage mode's such a fucking bother." He's misinterpreting Pain's response here. For one, the third databook describes Pain as being aloof and says that it's impossible to read his emotions, but also Pain's tone is one of distant, arrogant, haughty condescension, and this is all intrinsically a part of his whole God of Peace and Judgment persona. He's not actually angry. He doesn't feel genuinely threatened by Sage mode. He finds it a nuisance and considers it worth dealing with, but suggesting he's like upset about it and losing his cool is just a complete misunderstanding of Pain's character. It's not until later in the fight, when Naruto really starts testing Pain's worldview and starts getting to Nagato emotionally, and Nagato himself is revealed, that we actually see Pain display any overt anger or frustration. This one is weird because it both under and overvalues Konohamaru at the same time. Before we get into it, let's make sure to identify our positive claims. When saying that character A is as fast as character B, the implication is usually that both characters have the same max speed, since obviously the speed that a character is moving at any given time can change over the course of a fight. So for this point to even be relevant, and this comparison to even be valid in the first place, we need to be able to demonstrate that Naraka and Konohamaru are both moving at their max speeds at some point in the exchange. Then there's also a second implied claim that all the paths of pain have the same max speed, which would also need to be demonstrated in and of itself. We need to understand the context of the Konohamaru versus Naraka fight. At this point, Nagato, through the Deva path, is about to give his speech to Tsunade. Nagato is also micromanaging the other paths, which are engaged in complex battles against multiple targets elsewhere in the village. The Naraka Path's job specifically is to gather intel about Naruto's whereabouts. He moves slowly, deliberately, and has this almost ritualistic process that he uses to interrogate people, which is part of Pain's whole God of Judgment persona. He also specifically needs to capture people alive to get information from them. When Konohamaru first shows up, Naraka is interrogating Ebisu, and Konohamaru tags the Naraka Path with Kunai. Konohamaru then starts yapping loudly and obviously about Naruto, and then Naraka starts going after him. So then Pain, while also focusing on a bunch of other things in the village, starts maneuvering the Naraka Path to grab this apparently dumb, noisy little brat. Pain doesn't initially consider Konohamaru a serious threat, and so he doesn't just want to one-shot him and kill him. He believes he can get some useful info on Naruto from him, so of course he's not going to come at Konohamaru at full strength. Konohamaru does dodge a couple of Naraka's taijutsu attacks, sure, but then the Naraka Path just straight up pins him against a wall. He just grabs him and pins him in one move. He was initially moving slow enough for Konohamaru to dodge a couple of his blows, then he just speeds up and grabs him with no difficulty. He also manages to take out Ebisu coming at him from behind with a kick without taking his focus off Konohamaru. He's clearly holding back. But we're forgetting something, aren't we? The Konohamaru that the Naraka Path grabbed onto was actually a shadow clone the whole time. Pain underestimated him. Konohamaru manages to rush in from behind and land a Rasengan on Naraka. He uses a shadow clone diversion and baits his opponent into letting his guard down, strategies that he no doubt learned from his mentor Naruto. So this wasn't just a speed feat for Konohamaru, it was also a tactical feat. This is what I mean by both overvaluing and undervaluing the kid. If Konohamaru is faster than Naraka, he's possibly even faster than the debaters are describing, since it was actually his clone that Naraka was fighting. But since Naraka wasn't fighting at full strength, it's still an overestimation of Konohamaru's speed relative to the Paths of Pain. Despite all that, I hope everyone understands that Konohamaru didn't actually break the Naraka Path. After Nagato recalls all the summons before the massive Shinra Tensei, the Naraka Path repairs Asura using the King of Hell. Naraka doesn't appear to have been damaged at all. Pain very well could have let Naraka get hit so he could follow up and grab the real Konohamaru at close range. At the very least, saying that Konohamaru took the path out just doesn't hold up. Lastly, before moving on, I just want to underscore the danger of using reaction feats as a metric to imply that two characters have the same max speed. For example, the debater suggests that Itachi is light speed, and that Kakashi reacts to Itachi, so Kakashi is faster than light, and since Pain reacts to Kakashi, Pain is even faster than light, and since Konohamaru reacted to Naraka, that would mean that Konohamaru is significantly faster than light. If you follow that chain of logic, it all appears to be internally logically consistent, but I'm sure you can see why it still just doesn't make any sense. I hope I don't have to explain to you why Konohamaru is not as fast as the fucking Raikage. As part of his scaling for Itachi, Noodles claimed that Pain struggled heavily against Jiraiya, a sanin level character. Since Itachi was able to effectively one-shot Orochimaru, another sanin level character, then Itachi should be able to easily take out Pain, right? As evidence for Pain struggling against Jiraiya, Noodles claimed that Jiraiya killed 5 Paths of Pain in their exchange. The thing is, none of this really happened. The first issue we should address is the use of the term sanin level. It's imprecise at best. The sanin are not all of the same strength, they don't have equivalent ability sets, so saying that a character could beat Tsunade, for example, doesn't necessarily mean that that character could also beat Orochimaru just because they're both sanin level. I do understand that saying someone is sanin level is meant to put them in a certain tier, like the term Kage level doesn't mean that all Kage are of the same strength, but it implies you've crossed a certain strength threshold to be considered Kage level in the first place, and the same applies to sanin level, but it doesn't mean that a character would necessarily perform the same against each of the sanin, or each of the individual Kage for that matter. Regardless, Itachi might be able to beat any of the sanin, or maybe even the Kage, with Genjutsu alone, sure, but other characters without powerful Genjutsu might do better or worse depending on which sanin they're matched up against. On that note, the way that Itachi wins his sanin level matchup is by using the Kasegui no Jutsu, also called Demonic Illusion Shackle Stakes, a non-Mangekyo Sharingan Genjutsu that's used to immobilize and incapacitate Orochimaru before the fight even really begins. In order for this scaling to be relevant to Pain, we'd need to demonstrate that this ocular Genjutsu would be as effective in a straight-up fight against the 6 paths as it was in a preemptive strike against Orochimaru, for which we'd also need to discuss Pain's Genjutsu resistance in general. I have a section on that coming up soon, so let's just put a pin in that for now. Alright, so did Jiraiya kill 5 paths of pain? The short answer is no. The slightly longer answer is that he maybe killed one of them and then temporarily disabled 3 of them, but they got back up and kept fighting a moment later. In no way, shape, or form did he kill 5 of Pain's paths. But we should take a second and define exactly what we mean by kill here. The paths of pain aren't technically alive in the traditional sense, so to avoid any confusion when I say killed or broken here, I'm using the same definition Nagato implies when he says the last pain is broken after Naruto takes out the Deva path. A path here is considered killed or broken when it's taken so much damage that it can no longer move or fight. For more examples of this from the Konoha fight, we can look at how the Asura path is broken after the Kakashi fight, and then how Asura, human, animal, and Naraka are all lying on the ground, immobilized, and in various states of disrepair when Tendo says, "This is the farthest Pain has ever been pushed," which, come to think of it, would be evidence that Jiraiya never killed more than 3. Going back to the Jiraiya fight, when the fight begins, not only is Tendo not present, but at first the animal path is the only one deployed at all. That path alone is able to put Jiraiya into a standstill with the chameleon summon. Jiraiya then needs help from Gamaken to fend off the dog summon, and Gamaken also tanks the bird summon. Jiraiya then needs to summon Ma and Pa in order to enter Sage mode. Up until that point, Jiraiya hasn't done any damage to Pain unless you include getting rid of the crustacean summon. Once Jiraiya activates Sage mode, he's able to fend off the bull, after which Pain brings out 2 other paths, still nowhere near displaying his full strength. Jiraiya does blitz one of the paths with a kick to the eyes that blinds it, which is great, but it doesn't kill it or even disable it. The path gets right back up just before Preta absorbs the wave of boiling oil. It fights Jiraiya in the smoke, and it's one of the 3 paths that gets caught up in the frog genjutsu, so this path definitely didn't die at this point in the fight like Noodle suggests. As Jiraiya keeps fighting the 3 paths, both his taijutsu and ninjutsu are completely ineffective. His Oromaru Sengan does nothing, the boiling oil does nothing, his Kabari Senbon does nothing, the Lion's Mane does nothing. Jiraiya himself says that he's gonna die unless he leaves and comes up with a plan. Thus far, Pain is essentially just toying with him and is definitely not struggling with him. Leading up to the frog genjutsu, things do change a bit. Jiraiya is able to use a clever combination of multiple jutsu to separate the paths and create an opening for himself to fight one of them one-on-one. This then gives him and the Toad Sages the chance to trap them all in a genjutsu. Now let me ask you this, should this count as a feat for Jiraiya or as an assist from Ma and Pa? You could argue that Jiraiya wouldn't have pulled this off without their help, but you could also argue that him being able to summon them is just part of his skill set. Either way, I think it's more correct to say that Pain's 3 paths struggled against 3 sages, rather than saying that Pain overall was heavily struggling against Jiraiya full stop. Anyway, these 3 paths are paralyzed, and Jiraiya shoves the stone swords through their chests. So this means that Jiraiya definitely killed 3 of the paths of Pain, right? Seems pretty clear cut, except that it's not for a few reasons. If these paths were truly dead, rather than just being stunned and pinned to the ground, then they'd need to be resurrected. Okay, we know that the Naraka path can use the King of Hell to repair the paths, so could Pain have used Naraka here? To answer that, we need to understand the mechanics of how the King of Hell works. It's actually fairly straightforward. Once the king is summoned, a broken body is inserted into its mouth. After a few moments, the character emerges fully healed and rejuvenated. Any superficial damage, like to their body or clothing, is also fixed. We see this happen in the Naruto fight both with the Asura path, who's completely repaired and also gets a brand new jacket, and with the Preta path, who gets back up and is able to fight. So, broken thing goes in, fixed shiny good as new thing comes out. When the 6 paths all show up for Jiraiya, take a look at human, Preta, and animal, the ones that got trapped in the frog genjutsu. Preta, human, and animal all have gash marks and bloodstains on their midsections where the Miyoboku swords had been stabbed into them. Their clothing is also still ripped, and most importantly, the damage to the human path's eyes from Jiraiya's kick earlier is still there as well. So if the King of Hell repairs all cosmetic and physical damage done to characters it's used on, and these paths don't show signs of being repaired, that means that these characters did not get repaired by the King of Hell, which means that they were disabled by the genjutsu and the swords, but weren't completely broken or killed by them. It might seem weird to suggest that a character can't take a sword through the chest and survive, but again, keep in mind that these paths are essentially puppeted corpses, and remember, this is a universe in which plenty of characters have superhuman durability feats and can keep fighting after suffering grievous wounds. Jiraiya keeps fighting after he loses an arm in this same fight, Deidara keeps fighting after he loses 2 arms. In part 1, Kid Neji is able to keep fighting, albeit briefly, with a huge gaping hole near his shoulder. Tsunade, a sanin level character, is able to fight with a sword through her chest and survives literally getting torn in half later in the series. And these characters are all living humans, not corpses being remote controlled with chakra rods. Also, look at the sequence of events on page 184 in chapter 379. We see a sword getting pulled out of one of the Pain's chests. One of the path begins saying, "now," then jumps out and finishes his sentence with, "in attendance the 6 paths of pain." For the Naraka path to have repaired the path that's getting the sword pulled out of him, the repairing would need to have taken place in that time frame between him saying "now" and then saying "in attendance." Obviously, it's hard to get an exact time calc there, but if we compare the amount of time it takes the King of Hell to resurrect the Asura path during the Naruto fight, does it make sense that this path would be resurrected before the end of the sentence? The fact of the matter is that we don't have any solid proof showing that Jiraiya definitely killed these 3 paths, and that they were definitely resurrected. We do get a conversation between Ma and Pa, where Pa wonders if one of the new paths revive one of the down ones, but Ma immediately calls this into question. She says, "There can't be that many jutsu that can revive 3 fellas that were assuredly dead. Are they really human?" In other words, she's disputing whether or not they were really dead. Shima, despite her age, despite her wisdom, is still unaware of any jutsu that is capable of this sort of feat. As readers, we've also only really encountered 2 resurrection jutsu, the Edo Tensei and Chio's life transference technique, and both are rare, esoteric, and come at an extreme cost. Shima has never experienced combat with a Rinnegan user. Neither Ma nor Pa nor Jiraiya understand how the chakra rods work, and they have no idea that Nagato is controlling them remotely. Ultimately, Shima concludes that they're no longer mortal, they're something else, something that these 3 sages don't understand yet. The fact is that Ma, Pa, and Jiraiya thought they killed the 3 paths, but they were mistaken. One of the other paths, probably the Naraka, removed the swords from their chests, the Genjutsu wore off, and they got back up, wounded, but not killed. So at this point in the fight, Jiraiya temporarily took down 3 paths of pain while fighting essentially a 3-on-3 battle. When the 4th path showed up, he immediately lost an arm, and Asura broadcasted his arrival, by the way, giving Jiraiya a chance to react. Jiraiya then tries to drag all the paths into a frog gourd dimension, but only manages to get 1. Now, I used to think that we could at least be sure that Jiraiya definitely killed the animal path by trapping it in the frog dimension, where it seems to have its lower half dissolved in the gastric acid. But after rereading the 3rd data book, I'm not so sure about that either. On page 157, we have this statement: "One path was dragged into the Keke space, and his activity was stopped, but it is not known whether or not he is dead." The Keke space, also called Gamma Hyoro, is described as a sealed dimension isolated from the outer world. Also, the frog jutsu that Jiraiya uses to infiltrate Amegakure is called the Gamma Gakure Jutsu, and its databook description reads, "The inside of the toad is a barrier space that blocks chakra." We know that Nagato controls the paths by sending chakra signals to the black chakra rods embedded in their bodies. We also know that this ability has a limited range, and on top of that, the chakra receivers extracted from the human path during the autopsy at Konoha start receiving signals when Pain gets close to the village during his attack. The human path's body is still basically in one piece. I thought the lower half of his body had been dissolved in the acid, but this isn't the case. We see during the autopsy that his legs are still intact. So if we put all that together, it looks like the reason the animal path stopped moving once Jiraiya trapped it wasn't because it was destroyed or damaged so much that it couldn't fight anymore. It was that the barrier space blocked Pain's chakra signals and prevented him from moving the path. Now, if you want to say that Jiraiya defeated the path, that would be accurate because he takes it out of the fight. But again, if we're using the term killed to mean that he destroyed it or did so much damage to it that it couldn't move or fight, even outside the barrier space, then no, Jiraiya probably didn't kill this path either. Remember, the whole point of this claim is to establish that Pain was struggling against Jiraiya because Jiraiya killed 5 of his paths. But the 3 of them that were temporarily disabled by the Frog Song Genjutsu got back up and started fighting again, and the one that was trapped in the frog barrier space, Jiraiya might have killed that, or he might not have. He might have just disabled it by cutting it off from Pain's chakra. All the other paths are in attendance at the end when Jiraiya is killed, and Pain was holding back the entirety of the fight. We never see Tendo use his abilities at all. The human path made physical contact with Jiraiya multiple times and never tried to rip out his soul. We never see the Naraka path try to grab him and feed his soul to the King of Hell. There's just so much more that Pain could have done if he was really going for the kill. and the moment he starts taking things seriously, he takes Jiraiya out immediately, which means that the claim that Jiraiya struggled heavily against the paths of pain is missing the point entirely. Okay, if that's true, how do we interpret the statement that Pain makes that he would have probably lost if Jiraiya knew their secret? This statement isn't mutually exclusive with what we've talked about thus far, but anyway, the consensus in the community is that if Jiraiya went in knowing how the paths worked, and knowing Nagato was behind them, he would have ignored the paths, found Nagato, and dealt with him one-on-one, which might have been more effective. Okay, so then why did Obito mock Pain for his performance against Jiraiya? Because he was being a dick. Pain and Konan are always boasting about how Pain is an invincible god and Pain's very arrogant, so Jiraiya shouldn't have been able to do any damage to him at all if he's so perfect. So Obito was basically just making fun of him and keeping his arrogance in check. This was the sort of thing I was referring to when I said that the debate sometimes felt like a 4-hour-long gish gallop. The debaters would make statements like Jiraiya killed 5 paths of pain, and then completely neglect to back up those claims, and then discard them and quickly try to move on to a new subject when their arguments didn't pan out, without ever clarifying or resolving the issues that they brought up in the first place. To actually understand the Jiraiya fight, and to arrive at an intellectually honest assessment of the Jiraiya versus Pain matchup, we have to take the time to go through the fight. We have to make sure we understand our definitions. We have to consider character statements in context and weigh them against other character statements, against databook statements, and other fights. It takes time. It's a lot, I know, but it's worth it. In the Naruto vs. Pain fight, when Naruto first throws the Rasen shuriken, the human path pulls the animal path out of the way. Noodles makes the claim that Nagato must have focused more chakra on the human path so it would be fast enough to do so. He doesn't provide evidence showing that this happened, but it's an interesting idea and I think it's worth talking about. To start off, I do think it's worth asking if Pain can just dump extra chakra into a given path to speed it up or make it stronger, why not just do that to the animal path, speed her up and have her jump out of the way on her own? Why give the chakra to the other path and make it strong enough to yank her away in time? Intuitively, it makes sense that Nagato can choose to limit or cut off his chakra flow to the paths and focus them elsewhere. We see him do this to focus on Tendo's jutsu for the massive Shinra Tensei, but it's not immediately clear if he can do that with every path, or if the paths each have an upper limit to how much chakra they can receive. Let's talk about what we do know. The paths of Pain are asymmetrical in their abilities, which means they have different ability sets that aren't all equivalent in strength. It also sounds like they're asymmetrical in strength, because we see the Asura path throw the animal path around a couple times, rather than just having her jump on her own or having another path throw her. Also, the sizes, shapes, and arrangements of chakra rods are different on each of the paths. So, does that mean their physical bodies and chakra rod configurations set a limit on how much chakra they can handle? Like, would it be possible for Pain to accidentally put too much chakra into the human path's punch, so that its arm breaks when the punch lands, like how Lee and Guy suffer bone breakage when they use the gates? In other words, is there an upper limit to how much chakra the bodies can handle? And then what about the chakra rods themselves? We have a statement describing how they heat up and vibrate in response to incoming signals. Is there an upper limit to the amplitude of chakra signals they can receive? Would the heat damage the host bodies at excessive levels? Would the chakra rods themselves break if overloaded? Can they even be overloaded? I tried to find concrete evidence for any of this stuff and honestly didn't come up with much. The fact of the matter is, we don't know all that much about the exact details of how the chakra rods work, so saying that Pain can freely allocate and modulate the chakra in this way might logically be possible, but is not directly evidenced. Here's my subjective take. Each of the paths is still a reanimated human corpse. The physical and genetic makeup of those individuals will result in differences in the speed, strength, and skills of each path, and I mean separately from the whole Nagato giving each path a specific Rinnegan Jutsu thing. They don't all necessarily have the same physical stats, in other words, and they can't necessarily be turboed out at any given time. I also disagree with the argument that each remaining path gets stronger if another path is killed. So like for example, when Naruto takes out the Asura path, the remaining 5 paths don't necessarily get stronger just because Nagato has fewer paths to focus on. Again, it kind of intuitively makes sense. Nagato is quote-unquote spending less mana per turn, but do we actually have any statements or concrete evidence showing that the other paths get a noticeable boost when one dies? I couldn't really find any. Let me know if you think I've missed something here. Again, it kind of makes sense, it's just hard to actually prove. Okay, now we finally get to talk about the Shinra Tensei. Swag brings up the fact that the Shinra Tensei is able to repel both ninjutsu and taijutsu. His suggestion is that Shinra Tensei actually disassembles or deconstructs a jutsu on some fundamental level. But according to both the databook and in manga descriptions, I don't think this is the case. The Shinra Tensei works by pushing jutsu away, not by deleting them or erasing them. Specifically, the statement that we get from the databook is that the Shinra Tensei's repulsive force is so strong that ninjutsu and taijutsu are equally ineffective against it. But it doesn't specify that the jutsu are annihilated, just repelled, in other words, pushed back. So if an incoming attack collides with the Shinra Tensei, the force pushes it back and cancels out its momentum, at which point it will then fizzle out, but it doesn't eat the chakra or just delete it outright. Here's a very clear example. When Naruto's shadow clones get hit by Shinra Tensei, they fly back and skid along the ground, rather than getting torn apart or immediately disappearing. For another example, when Tendo Pain uses it on Kakashi's Raikiri, the Raikiri isn't immediately switched off, it remains active on Kakashi's hand, the lightning even seems to arc forward and around the source of the blast. Swag claims it's being ripped off his hand, but that's not really what's happening here, it's just discharging rather than being nullified. Swag also suggested that because the Shinra Tensei doesn't always create craters, it could be used in a nullification-only mode, but that doesn't really hold up either, unfortunately. The Shinra Tensei isn't like a spherical jutsu that expands outward in every direction. It's a repulsive force that can be shaped and directed. It will create craters if it's aimed at the ground, like when Kakashi lunges up from under the earth, Tendo uses a Shinra Tensei on him there, and that creates a crater, but that's just because he's firing it down in that direction. Okay, so is there an upper limit to that effect? The debaters asked if the Shinra Tensei would cancel out the lava Rasen shuriken, for example. How can we evaluate that? On the one hand, the databook states that the Shinra Tensei repels ninjutsu. The Rasen shuriken is a ninjutsu, so categorically it's included, and so the Shinra Tensei should work on it. The databook does also describe it as the invisible hand of God, which repels anything in creation. We should take that with a grain of salt though, databook statements tend to be hyperbolic. What we do know is that Pain has the ability to focus, direct, and amplify the Shinra Tensei. Obviously we see him do this when he blows up the whole Leaf Village. So if he took all the power that was behind that massive Shinra Tensei and focused it into a narrow area and directed that at the Lava Rasen Shuriken, he should be able to blow it up, right? The same principles still apply in both situations. Remember, Pain was able to dissipate Naruto's Rasen Shuriken with Shinra Tensei multiple times during their fight. It's just a question of magnitude, rather than a question about whether this sort of thing would work in general. On the other hand, we also know that ultimately, the strength of any jutsu is determined by the amount of chakra invested into it, the skill of its wielder, and some other factors like elemental affinities. The Lava Rasen Shuriken is used by Sage of Six Paths Naruto, amplified by Son Goku, and it manages to seriously damage Jubi Madara. We are talking exponentially higher levels of chakra here than what Pain displays with his average Shinra Tensei. Considering how much more chakra Sage of Six Paths Naruto has, especially with that Son Goku amp, there's a good chance that the Lava Rasen Shuriken could just bypass the Gravity Blast. I think there are decent arguments on either side for this one. The discussion of what the Shinra Tensei can and can't nullify leads to the debaters mentioning that Six Tails Naruto did repel the jutsu, so if the Nine Tails Chakra Cloak counts as a ninjutsu and it resisted the Shinra Tensei, that would be evidence against the whole repels all ninjutsu thing, right? To this, Swag points out that the Nine Tails Chakra is not a ninjutsu, to which Noodles responds with probably the worst line of the debate. That's like saying that a pizza is not a pasta.
Yeah.
But you know what I mean?
If my grandmother had wheels, she would have been a bike. It doesn't make any sense what you said.
Now, I hate to break this to y'all, but spoiler alert, pizza and pasta, different fucking foods. They're prepared differently, they're presented differently, they use different sauces and cheeses, they're different foods, they're not the same. The fact that they both use a starchy carbohydrate as a base and often have cheese and sauce and you can get them both at fucking Buca di Beppo does not make them the same food. Okay, so is the Kyuubi cloak actually a ninjutsu? If it is just the Kyuubi's raw chakra, then no, it's not a ninjutsu. Chakra is kind of like a raw ingredient that is then shaped, sculpted, and processed into an assembled thing called a ninjutsu. See, they're different things. We know chakra can be infused with different natures like fire and water, which obviously gives them different properties, right? You wouldn't say that a fireball jutsu and a water wall jutsu have the same properties or the same strengths and weaknesses just because they both contain chakra. They're obviously categorically different. A better example than the pizza pasta point is that chakra is like dough and ninjutsu is like bread. Dough undergoes a chemical process of transformation and solidification to become bread. You can usually safely eat fresh bread, but you can't always safely eat raw dough. You can usually sculpt dough, and it has liquid-like properties that let it conform to the shape of a container that you put it in, which you can't usually do with cooked bread either. I could go on, but you get the point. Raw dough and bread are two different things, even though they're composed of some of the same ingredients. As a side note, just for the sake of being thorough, there may be some exceptions, like the Yamanaka mind transfer technique, which is listed on the Naruto wiki as not using a nature transformation, but rather being a discharge of spiritual energy, possibly similar to how taijutsu is a discharge of physical energy, but obviously those are rare exceptions and the general principle still applies. To bring this back to the debate, the whole question here is whether the Nine-Tails chakra cloak is functionally the same as something like the Raikage's lightning cloak, and the answer is probably not really. The difference here is that the Kyuubi chakra is raw chakra, and the lightning cloak is chakra that has been accumulated, shaped, and infused with a nature transformation. They are made from the same basic ingredients, but that does not mean they necessarily have the same properties, limitations, or that they function in the same way. Now, all that being said, I don't think the Shinra Tensei would nullify the Raikage's cloak. I still stand by my earlier implication that the way the Shinra Tensei works is by pushing ninjutsu away rather than disassembling them. I agree with the debaters that it wouldn't knock someone out of the 8 gates either. I don't think it would disable stuff like Kakuzu's Earth Spear Diamond Armor either. But at the same time, it's also very important to understand that there's a fundamental difference between ninjutsu and the raw chakra that makes it up. Most importantly, I just want people to understand that categorically, there is a difference between ninjutsu and chakra. The debaters brought up the question of jutsu with mutually exclusive properties. For example, Swag is claiming that the Shinra Tensei is a ninjutsu and it nullifies all other ninjutsu. And also, the truth-seeking orbs are ninjutsu that are stated to nullify all other ninjutsu. So, what would happen if these two clashed? Well, Noodles claims that since this represents an inherent contradiction, we can't even discuss it in good faith and just have to move on. I disagree. The fact that two statements appear to be logically contradictory doesn't mean you can't discuss them or try to come up with an argument as to how to resolve that contradiction. For example, in the War Arc, the truth-seeking orbs are said to nullify all ninjutsu, and Obito's staff is made of the same stuff. So when he clashes with Madara, Madara's truth-seeking orbs come into contact with Obito's staff and they just bounce off one another. Here's an example of two jutsu with mutually exclusive properties clashing. In the Naruto universe, if two equal jutsu clash, the one with more chakra behind it will beat the lesser one. Otherwise, they'll just cancel each other out unless one has an elemental advantage over the other. I think it's totally reasonable to argue that that principle still applies here as well. If an unstoppable force in the Naruto universe meets an immovable object, they could just bounce off one another, cancel each other out, annihilate, or interact in some other unprecedented fashion. There's no inherent contradiction here. We're just introducing an exception to the established rules of the universe, which is kind of what Swag was getting at with his Greg analogy. But again, if the amount of force and pressure behind the orb is vastly superior to the blast force of the Shinra Tensei's gravity wave, I don't see why it wouldn't just punch a hole right through it, unless the Shinra Tensei does have that complete nullification behavior that Swag brought up. On the other hand, Pain could just make the Shinra Tensei wide enough to keep on going as the orb passes right through it. We actually have another great example of this from the War Arc. In chapter 555, Dodai tells Naruto that the Raikage has an invincible spear and impenetrable armor. Naruto redirects this invincible spear into the impenetrable armor and gets the win on the Raikage. So here we have a contradiction. An invincible weapon against an invincible shield. What happens? Oh, I guess we can't talk about it because it represents a contradiction. Naruto should have just apologized and stopped fighting the Raikage because of his contradictory ability set. See, we don't have to take all these statements at face value. We can look for precedents and general principles throughout the series. Okay, see, this is actually getting kinda interesting, isn't it? We can have an interesting discussion about this. The only wrong answer here would be to just dismiss the entire scenario wholesale because it represents a contradiction. As part of a discussion about Pain's overall ability set, the human path's ability to rip people's souls out comes up, and Noodles makes the claim that the best scaling we have for the Ningendo is Shizune, implying that it works only on characters of her power level or below. I want to start this section by reading an excerpt from the 4th databook statement on the human path. The description reads, "Instant contact between minds. By pulling out a human soul, this jutsu steals life. A person's end comes when the hand is placed over his head, and then all that person's thoughts without exception are offered to the user, a completely inhuman jutsu. Even if the victim tries to resist, the opponent's information is deciphered, a power that is almost a divine miracle. The end comes when the memories are read, an instant death." So according to this description, as long as Pain can make physical contact with his opponent, he will then be able to read that opponent's mind and then instantly kill them. Now, as with any databook statement, we should take this with a grain of salt. There are probably some limitations to this, so we'll talk about in just a minute, but nothing about this description implies that it is only effective on people of a relatively low power level. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Ningendo's soul-stealing ability isn't given an upper limit in the manga, which, to be clear, doesn't mean it has no upper limit. It just means we shouldn't necessarily assume that its upper limit is whatever character we happen to see it be used on. In other words, just because we only see it being used on Shizune and a couple other nameless shinobi during the Pain fight, doesn't mean it only works on people of their power level or lower. Swag mentions that Kabuto and Obito casually refer to using it on Yamato, which implies it could work on targets of a much higher level than Shizune, and then we see it being used against Naruto in the Edo fight in chapter 551. Kabuto specifically mentions it's the Ningendo's ability rather than Jigokudo to avoid confusion, and Kabuto also mentions that he plans to use it on Naruto and B. It's worth noting that it doesn't work on Naruto instantly. Naruto is able to resist it somewhat, although it's still effective. Naruto comments that he feels his life force being drained. So here we have some scaling that Noodles could have potentially used in his argument instead of just facetiously dismissing the whole thing. In other words, if Edo Nagato, who is much more powerful and has all of his chakra consolidated into one body, compared to when he's puppeting the paths of pain remotely, isn't able to instantly rip out Naruto's soul when he's in KCM, if you agree that the Ningendo's abilities would be comparatively less powerful in 6 Paths of Pain mode, then it would scale below KCM1 Naruto by definition. But that's assuming that the jutsu scales in that manner. This is a Rinnegan 6 Paths ability type thing. It's kind of a hack, it doesn't necessarily work the same way as other jutsu, but you could at least use that as a basis for an argument, instead of just saying, oh, we only have Shizune to go off of, so dismiss it entirely. The main difficulty in scaling Ningendo is that we don't have that many feats to scale it off of, but what we have seen is that it instantly pulls the souls out of people of Shizune's level and is still capable of pulling the souls out of much stronger targets like KCM Naruto, even if it takes a little bit longer. So what does this all mean for Itachi? Well, if you agree that Itachi vaguely scales to KCM1 Naruto, you could either say Ningendo worked on Naruto there, so even if it was weaker with the human path on his own, it would still eventually work on Itachi, it might just take a little longer. Or you could take the opposite stance and say, since it took that long to rip Naruto's soul out, Itachi would be able to break free before Pain could get his soul. Either of those I think would be valid arguments and would be worth discussing. Again, the only mistake here is just to say that it only worked on Shizune and then move on. Itachi is obviously an expert level Genjutsu user. We've seen him one-shot Orochimaru with a Genjutsu, he's trapped other characters in Genjutsu by just moving a finger, he even took out Kakashi instantly with the Tsukuyomi. The question is, would his Genjutsu be as effective on Pain? Would a Genjutsu cast on an individual path of Pain affect the other paths? And would it affect Nagato as well, or would Itachi need to use multiple Genjutsu to take out the whole pack? And does the Rinnegan itself have any innate Genjutsu resistance? Before we get deeper into this, I just want to remind everyone that the Rinnegan that Pain has are actually Madara's eyes that were transplanted into Nagato when he was a kid. More specifically, these are the eyes of Izuna, Madara's brother, which were awakened as Sharingan, evolved into Mangekyo Sharingan, transplanted into Madara to further develop into Eternal Mangekyo Sharingan, and then fully awakened as Rinnegan after Madara assimilated Senju DNA later in his life. So when we talk about Nagato's eyes, Nagato's Jojutsu, stuff like that, these are the eyes we're talking about. That doesn't mean that Nagato can use them as well as Madara necessarily, or that he has access to all of Madara's Sharingan abilities, but these are still Madara's eyes that he's essentially loaned out. That being said, would Pain be able to resist Mangekyo Genjutsu in a fight against Itachi? Well, for one, keep in mind that Pain actually needs to be looking into Itachi's eyes for the Tsukuyomi to affect him. In part 1, Guy has developed a strategy for fighting against Sharingan users, where he simply reads their movements by looking at their lower body and avoiding their gaze. Nagato, with the Rinnegan, is able to see through the eyes of all the paths and all of his animal summons. So you could argue that Pain could just use that shared field of vision to avoid ever looking into Itachi's eyes. You could potentially counter that, though, by arguing that more active eyes means more targets for Itachi to potentially focus on, and some of those animal summons have big-ass eyes as well. So, more importantly, if Itachi does successfully cast Tsukuyomi on one of Pain's summons or bodies, can Pain resist it and break free of it, or does that just mean that Itachi takes the fight? As a quick review, Genjutsu techniques are illusions. They work by confusing the target's brain and tricking their senses, essentially causing hallucinations. The most common ways we see Genjutsu used in the series are visual and auditory, but regardless of whether a Genjutsu is generated from a sound or a visual source, ultimately it's the user's brain that is deceived by the illusion. So in order for an illusion to work on someone, they need functioning senses and or functioning brains. Now of course we know that Genjutsu can work on the paths, since Manpa's Song Genjutsu, also called Gamarinsho, successfully paralyzed the 3 paths of Pain during the Jiraiya vs. Pain fight. But remember, we only see 3 of the paths in the water prison illusory space, the ones that actually heard the song. In other words, it looks like the paralysis effect didn't spread to the other paths or to Nagato himself. This would seem to imply that each of the paths essentially has their own functioning brain and nervous system that can perceive and be fooled by an incoming Genjutsu stimulus. Specifically, in the case of the Gamarinsho, the paths' physical bodies are paralyzed as their senses appear to be caught up in the illusory space. By the way, I want to respond to Noodles' claim that the paths weren't quote-unquote seeing that illusion with the 4 giant frogs and the cube of water just because it was a sound Genjutsu. Yes, they were seeing the space. Even though the Genjutsu was triggered via sound, the sound is affecting the nerves and the brains of the paths, causing them to experience an illusion, which includes them seeing the water space and the cube and the frogs and everything. Taiyuya's flute Genjutsu, Chains of Fantasia, also comes up in the debate, and it works the same way. Shikamaru, Itachi, and Sasuke all hear the notes of the Genjutsu. This auditory stimulus acts upon their brains to fool them into thinking they're trapped in an illusory space. Shikamaru does actually see his arm melting, and Sasuke and Itachi also see the illusory landscape around them, even though the Genjutsu is sound-based because it's tricking their brain into seeing it. It's essentially like a hallucination, and you can have visual and auditory hallucinations with your eyes closed in a quiet room without any external stimulus based entirely on activity inside your brain. Genjutsu stimulates your brain to cause a hallucination. So the fact that we only see 3 paths in the Gamarinsho illusory space, and the fact that sound Genjutsu need to be heard by their targets, seems to indicate that the other paths weren't affected. However, the paths of Pain don't necessarily all share a sense of hearing, but they do have a shared field of vision with the Rinnegan. Nagato can see and hear everything the paths see and hear, but the paths each individually share the vision of every other path as well, if that makes sense. So maybe a visual Genjutsu would spread between them, even if a sound-based one doesn't. Anyway, let's acknowledge that pretty much any Genjutsu below the Tsukuyomi tier is probably just not going to work on Pain. We know that standard Genjutsu can be disrupted by interrupting or disturbing one's chakra flow, which Nagato should be able to do easily with the paths, even if it's something as simple as just turning them off and then back on again. So he'd likely be able to shrug off any baseline Genjutsu, but what about the Tsukuyomi? Would the Tsukuyomi actually affect Nagato's brain if cast on the paths? I've been through the series, I've thought about this a great deal, and I finally have an answer for all this. I don't fucking know, man. The thing about this is that we don't know how the path senses are connected to Nagato himself. Pa gives us a visual metaphor that makes it look like their vision is viewed by Nagato like a series of security cameras. So like, if Itachi casts a Genjutsu on a camera and Nagato watches it, does it affect him, or does he need to actually see it unfiltered? Also, much later on in the series, Sasuke's Susanoo blocks the light from the infinite Tsukuyomi, which renders it ineffective on the people inside the Susanoo. This could be hinting that if the visual stimulus of a Tsukuyomi is distorted or obstructed, rather than making it to the target's eyes directly, that it just wouldn't work on them. So as for Pain, how does the connection between the vision from the paths and Nagato's own brain really work? Is it a direct link that makes it equivalent to Nagato just seeing things with his own eyes? Or does the fact that his sight is being filtered through other eyes impact the way that visual genjutsu affect him? We don't really know how that visual link works as far as I can tell. It's also worth considering that back in chapter 260, when Itachi tries to use genjutsu on Kakashi's clone, he sees a clone appear in his genjutsu space, but it's ineffective on Kakashi's real body. You could interpret this as evidence that even if genjutsu works on a clone or puppet, it won't affect the host. On a similar note, I doubt that casting a genjutsu on an Edo Tensei would affect Kabuto, even though he can clearly see and hear through them in some way. Unfortunately, I don't think we have enough evidence to prove that the Tsukuyomi would transfer from one path to Nagato himself. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that Itachi did land a Tsukuyomi on Nagato, would he be able to break out of it? As the debaters discussed, Sasuke was able to break out of Itachi's Tsukuyomi with his base Sharingan, so how would Nagato do with his Rinnegan? According to Zetsu, the Mangekyo Sharingan is categorically stronger than the base Sharingan, and due to that advantage, Sasuke shouldn't have been able to resist Itachi's Genjutsu at all, but he was able to break free due to his superior skill. Zetsu compares the Mangekyo to a shuriken, and the base Sharingan to a pebble, but says a fighter with a shuriken could still lose to somebody armed with pebbles if they're skilled enough with those pebbles. In addition to all that, Itachi says that what you need to break free of the Tsukuyomi is a Kekkei Genkai and a Mangekyo Sharingan, both of which Nagato technically has, although this obviously isn't strictly necessary since Sasuke manages just fine without him. Sasuke does also predict that his Rinne Sharingan can break people free of the infinite Tsukuyomi, in other words that Rinnegan Genjutsu can probably counter Rinnegan Genjutsu, and he's able to put all the Bijuu under Genjutsu control in an instant, despite not being listed as a user of Tsukuyomi himself. Let's put all that together with what we know about Genjutsu resistances, counters, and reflection techniques from earlier in the series. By doing so, we can come up with a little equation. A character's ability to resist or break free of the Tsukuyomi is a product of a few things: the inherent biological strength of their eyes, their ability with Genjutsu overall, and their ability with their eyes specifically. And more emphasis is put on an individual's overall ocular skill above the other two categories. Remember, Zetsu compared Itachi's eyes to shuriken and Sasuke's to pebbles, but Sasuke's skill with his pebbles is superior to Itachi's skill with his shuriken. Danzo actually gives us a great explanation of all this. He outright states that Sasuke's Genjutsu abilities are a far cry from Itachi's Tsukuyomi, which were more powerful and dangerous outright. However, Sasuke was able to win his fight against Danzo not with one big, powerful, dramatic Genjutsu use, but by subtle, careful manipulation, by tricking and deceiving Danzo and winning through cunning rather than raw power. This is arguably a more skillful and technical use of the Sharingan than Itachi just catching somebody in his gaze. Sasuke actually doesn't have a ton of impressive power-based Genjutsu feats up until this point in the series, nothing on the level of the Tsukuyomi, so he doesn't even have to have a roster of powerful Genjutsu himself to be able to resist the Tsukuyomi. He just needs to be very skillful in how he uses the techniques that he does have. So getting back to Nagato, as long as Nagato has eyes that are biologically as strong or stronger than Hebisasuke's base Sharingan, as long as Nagato can use his dojutsu with the same or higher level of skill as Hebisasuke, and as long as Nagato is at least marginally skilled with Genjutsu at all, Pain should be able to resist the Tsukuyomi. These are the Rinnegan we're talking about after all. So if the base Sharingan is Pebble tier, and the Mangekyo Sharingan is Shuriken tier, the Eternal Mangekyo would be even stronger, like, I don't know, Gun tier, and the Rinnegan would be even stronger than that, like 50 cal tier or something. And in terms of skill specifically, I think people forget that the 6 Paths of Pain is a Rinnegan ability. It's a dojutsu skill. I mean, this is all we really need. Pain is able to remotely control 6 separate bodies, each with their own unique and powerful abilities. He could be reading someone's mind with Human, absorbing chakra with Preta, using Shinra Tensei and Bansho Tenin to take on multiple Jonin with the Deva Path, interrogating people with Naraka, manipulating multiple animal summons with Animal, and firing off volleys of missiles with the Asura Path, all at the same time. And we know this for a fact because that's exactly what he does during his attack on Konoha. All of that is based on ocular jutsu. I think it's very, very clear that Pain is at least as skilled with his eyes as Hebisasuke is with his, which means that even if Pain's eyes are Pebble tier, he should be able to break free of the Tsukuyomi, and we know that they're much stronger than that. If you're still not convinced, let's go over the eyes real quick. Remember, Nagato's Rinnegan were previously Madara's Mangekyo Sharingan. Madara used them in his countless daily battles before passing them on to Nagato, Think about all the things those eyes have seen, all the fights they would have been used in, even long before becoming Rinnegan. Then add that to all Nagato's personal experience, his training with Jiraiya, everything he went up against as an Akatsuki member, the wars, all that. These eyes have probably seen more consistent and intense battle than any other shinobi alive, except for, I don't know, maybe Onoki and the Toad Sages. Oh, and speaking of the Toads, we know that Jiraiya taught Naruto about Genjutsu resistances, and he trained Nagato for 3 years, giving him special attention since he saw him as a potential child of prophecy. I think it's pretty reasonable to assume that Nagato would have learned a thing or two about Genjutsu and all that, and especially given that characters like Deidara that don't have any special eye biology are able to train their base eyes to counter the Sharingan specifically, the fact of the matter is that Pain just has a massive advantage going up against pretty much any other ocular ability. In the next section, I'll be talking about Inoichi breaking into the Amegakure shinobi's mind and bypassing the Genjutsu traps and blockers in his way. It's implied that those were Nagato's doing, which would suggest a high level of Genjutsu proficiency on Nagato's behalf. So when we put all that together, what do we have? Well, Nagato physically has the strongest eyes we see up until the war arc. He's able to use those eyes with an extremely high level of technical skill. He also has some basic Genjutsu skill, probably an advanced level actually. He is categorically superior or equal to Heavy Sasuke in every aspect of his eyes and ocular jutsu, so if Sasuke can resist the Tsukuyomi, so can Pain. Look, even if you disagree with me, think about all the layers of unknowns here and ask yourself this. If Itachi wasn't certain about Pain's Genjutsu resistances, would he even use the Tsukuyomi in the first place? I think it's likely that Itachi would consider all those factors we discussed, and maybe try the Tsukuyomi once or perhaps even not at all. Remember, it carries a pretty significant risk factor given how exhausting it is to use. I think there's a good argument here that Itachi would just save his strength for an extra Amaterasu cast, or for more time with the Susanoo active. Perhaps he'd use it after taking out a few of the paths to try to seal the deal, but I doubt that he would try to lead the fight with this ability. And regardless, Pain would almost certainly just shrug it off either way. Amaterasu is one of Itachi's most powerful abilities. Right off the bat, the debaters agreed that the Amaterasu should be able to damage all of Pain's paths, as long as it's left uninterrupted and allowed to burn them down. Noodles specifically makes 3 main claims about the Amaterasu's AP. That the Amaterasu would be able to instantly cover an entire battlefield in one use, that the Amaterasu instantly incinerates or incapacitates any enemy that it hits, and that a single use of Amaterasu would be able to incinerate all of the paths of Pain in one shot. This is all a vast overestimation of the Amaterasu's power. The thing is, we don't actually see the Amaterasu achieve the feats that Noodles is describing here. It burns its targets, sure, but it takes time to do so. It can spread out to cover a large area, sure, but it takes time to do so. Funny enough, apart from White Zetsus and Ten Tails clones, I don't think we actually see anyone die to Amaterasu throughout the whole series, because there's a lot of ways of avoiding or getting around it. It is a powerful jutsu, don't get me wrong, but it has limitations, and we're going to need to understand those limitations before we can properly scale it to a matchup against Pain. Okay, let's start by addressing the claim that Itachi can instantly light an entire battlefield on fire because he supposedly did so at the Uchiha hideout versus Sasuke. Your Honor, simply stated, my client didn't do that shit. First of all, battlefield is kind of a vague term at best. If we want to use the Uchiha hideout as a standard of measurement, that's fine. We just need to keep in mind that battlefields vary in size, scale, and terrain. Either way, it's just plain incorrect to say that Itachi lights the whole forest on fire with a single Amaterasu. What happens is this. He uses 3 different casts of Amaterasu that all miss Sasuke and land in the rings of trees at the upper level of the hideout. The flames then gradually spread out across the trees. They don't instantly burn the trees down, and they don't burn through the stone ring structures surrounding the trees. So if by battlefield you mean an area equivalent to those 2 rings of trees, okay, we could use that as a point of reference, but Noodles clearly means the entire area was set on fire with 1 Amaterasu, and that didn't happen at all. After the Sasuke and Itachi fight, we do see that the surrounding forest is on fire, but this doesn't happen right away, and it's an indirect consequence of Itachi's actions. As the fight progresses, part of one of the burning trees snaps off and falls into the greater forest area. The fire is propagating of its own accord at this point. If you want to say Itachi started a forest fire, with 3 casts of Amaterasu, not 1, that would be true, but Noodles is describing it as though he lit the entire forest on fire with a single napalm strike or something, and that's just false. It's also important to notice that the fire is still burning after the Itachi and Sasuke fight, worth noting because the Amaterasu takes a while to burn down its targets, so any claims that Noodles makes to the effect that the Amaterasu would instantly one-shot its targets also don't reflect how it actually works. Every time we see the Amaterasu used, with one exception, it takes time to actually burn through its targets. The targets never instantly vaporize or melt or disintegrate, they're gradually consumed by the flames. This applies to all the targets, humans, animals, biju, trees. The exception I mentioned is with the first time we see the Amaterasu used on the belly of Jiraiya's rock toad, where it seems to just punch right through the wall. It's worth noting though that the flames don't rapidly spread out from the area around the hole, they're just kind of smoldering when Jiraiya shows up to seal them. Even though Itachi uses multiple Amaterasu on the trees around the hideout, they still don't instantly vaporize. They burn down gradually. The Amaterasu that Itachi plants in Sasuke's eye doesn't immediately kill Obito. The Amaterasu that Sasuke uses on B spreads quickly, but it doesn't immediately incinerate him, and B has time to respond with the substitution and to get away safely. It doesn't immediately incinerate Karin either. Hell, it doesn't even totally destroy her jacket. Later, at the 5 Kage summit, Sasuke's Amaterasu doesn't immediately kill the samurai or even destroy his armor. It doesn't immediately incinerate A, in fact it hasn't even started to burn through his arm bracer when he cuts off his arm. It doesn't immediately incinerate Danzo either, although that is a weird case due to the Izanagi hacks. Itachi's Amaterasu doesn't immediately incinerate Edo Nagato, it gets through his arm over the course of an extended conversation between Naruto, B, and Itachi, which we'll talk about separately. It does rapidly spread and cover the bird and dog summons, but it doesn't instantly kill them either, since we don't immediately see that puff of smoke that we always get when clones or summons are destroyed. And finally, just for fun, it's kind of amusing that Sasuke's Amaterasu, used on Madara during the war arc, doesn't instantly kill him either. He just takes off his armor and he's totally fine. I mostly mentioned that one because it's just amusing to me how taking off your clothes seems to be a hard counter to the Amaterasu. But the point is, the Amaterasu takes time to kill its targets. Actually, the Amaterasu kinda has a lot of counters when you think about it. You can dodge it if you're fast enough, we see the Raikage do this during the 5 Kage summit. You can block it with your own armor or clothing, you can use summon substitutions or clones to take a hit for you. If the Amaterasu hits one of your limbs, you can cut the limb off to stop the spread of the fire. You can probably absorb it with abilities like the Preta Path. You can push it off with stuff like the Shinra Tensei. So on paper, Pain actually has a pretty wide range of counters available to him. By the way, I know we're using Sasuke's eyes rather than Itachi's eyes for some of our data points in the above examples, but they're still relevant to the Pain vs Itachi fight for a few reasons. For one, Sasuke and Itachi are brothers and clan members, so their eyes should be genetically similar. Danzo even says in chapter 477, two brothers whose abilities are identical, how could what their eyes perceive be so different? This is during his fight with Sasuke, of course. For another point, several characters mention that Sasuke has surpassed his brother in ocular powers during the 5 Kage summit. Obito also has a couple statements where he says that Sasuke's eyes are coming along nicely and he expects them to surpass Itachi soon. And then finally, we get to see Sasuke use his Amaterasu with completely fresh eyes, unaffected by blindness, at least for the first few casts. At the end of the day, apart from like Itachi's crow and maybe Danzo, we just don't have any feats demonstrating that the Amaterasu can instantly burn down its targets, which means we don't have any clear evidence that Itachi could instantly melt any of the paths, or any of the animal summons for that matter. Could Itachi use the Amaterasu several times in quick succession and light multiple summons and paths on fire in a short time span, taking them out of the fight at least temporarily? Absolutely. Could he create large-scale hazards or terrain denial by casting flames that propagate over parts of the battlefield over time? Absolutely. But could he instantly vaporize all the paths and summons and ignite an entire battlefield on fire with one single use of Amaterasu? No, we don't really have any scaling or evidence to suggest that that would be the case. Oh, and one more thing. Substitution Jutsu. Pain can use Substitution Jutsu. We see him do so in the Jiraiya fight, and Pain can also detect the buildup of chakra in Itachi's eyes, and is familiar with the Amaterasu, so he'd be ready for it, and would be ready to use a substitution. If he sees it coming in advance as well, he wouldn't even need to be faster than the Amaterasu's cast or travel speed. So before we even get to whether or not the Amaterasu can damage the paths, we need to consider whether he'd even be able to hit any of them in the first place. The animal summons, though, are probably a little harder to miss, so let's talk about them next. Regarding the summons, Noodles also makes this claim that Itachi would just instantly light all the summons on fire and take them out at once with a single Amaterasu. Okay, so a few problems with this. Firstly, this assumes that Nagato would deploy all the summons at once, which we've never seen him do. He usually sends out one or two at a time and withdraws them when they're no longer effective. Next, this implies that the Amaterasu can be used like a flamethrower and can just fan out over a wide area with a single cast. And that's not the case either. When the jutsu is cast, it always has a central core with flames fanning out and spiraling out around it. Itachi seems to be able to manipulate that core to a certain extent. The last time he uses it against Sasuke, it almost looks like he's dragging it around with his gaze and having it chase behind Sasuke until it connects with him. But to be clear, this is him manipulating the core of the jutsu that he just cast, rather than like spewing out a constant stream of fire from his eyes. And this is evidenced by the fact that we see multiple cores appearing behind Sasuke, each with their own little onomatopoeia sound effect, rather than just one huge continuous stream of fire. If Itachi were facing multiple summons, he'd have to use multiple Amaterasu to try to take them down. Notice that I said try to take them out, because even if Itachi does tag them, that's not a guarantee that they'd be down for the count. For one, Preta can absorb jutsu, and Shinra Tensei can blow the flames away, so Pain at least has a chance to get the flames off before they completely destroy the summons. We'll talk about the Preta path in Shinra Tensei in a lot more detail in just a second, but for now, for the sake of argument, let's just say that if Itachi hits the bird, the chameleon, the ox, the rhino, and the centipede summons with Amaterasu, the flames would spread out all over them like it did to the dog and bird in the Edo fight, and would just take them down. Okay, so what about the panda? This one's a little bit trickier. The panda tanks a Kabari Senbon from Sage Jiraiya at close range, and it isn't unsummoned. It also doesn't seem to react like it's in pain, like the dog and the bird do when they're hit with Amaterasu. And the texture on the panda's skin makes it look like it might be made of stone or have some other hardening ability to it. You could argue that most of the summons, like the bull for example, would be taken out of the fight even if they're not completely incinerated, because they might be thrashing around in pain while on fire, like the dog and the bird were. But would the same thing happen to the panda? If not, the animal path could potentially use this thing as a shield for an extended period of time. It could also resummon it to different locations, and could potentially try to do stuff like summoning it from in mid-air on the bird and dropping it on Itachi's head. Okay, maybe that's a silly example, but my point is, it might not be immediately taken out like some of the other paths, and it could be used in creative ways. Most importantly, it could potentially be used to block multiple Amaterasu before it's vaporized. We also gotta talk about that dog summon. Remember, Nagato says the dog multiplies itself every time it takes damage. It's actually referred to in the third databook specifically as the endless summoning jutsu. The databook clarifies that Nagato can give the summoned creature different conditions, such as multiply when attacked, and that it can split up into multiple bodies as well. I'm not sure if there's a stated upper limit to that effect, but we have seen up to 10 individual heads on this summon at once, and those heads can then split off into individual dogs. When Itachi lights it on fire during the Edo Nagato fight, it looks like he uses two separate casts on two of its heads, and then the fire begins to spread. If the other heads, the ones that Itachi doesn't immediately hit with Amaterasu, start to split off, then things get more complicated. Itachi now has several more targets to deal with, smaller, faster moving targets that can move in different directions, and although we don't see the dog split up during this fight, remember, he's been shown to do so in both of his other fights, and Kabuto is the one pulling the strings in this encounter. I think it's reasonable to expect that the dog would split up if Pain were in full control. Alright, that just leaves us with one more summon, the crab. And spoiler alert, I saved the best for last here. Everybody forgets about the crab, but this little guy actually has a hard counter for the Amaterasu. Wanna know why? Well, remember the water attack that the crab used to wash Jiraiya's oil off of Konan? Well, according to the third databook, this is called Water Release Raging Froth, and its description reads, this crab's bubble jutsu can wash away all ninjutsu. All ninjutsu. That includes the Amaterasu. So even if Itachi lights an entire battlefield on fire, even if Itachi lights all the animal summons on fire, even if Itachi lights all the paths themselves on fire at the same time, all Pain has to do is sit back and let the crab do its car wash jutsu, and the Amaterasu is literally flushed. Now for the record, I don't think Raging Froth will extinguish the flames per se, but it doesn't need to. All it needs to do is to separate the flames from whatever they're currently burning through and push them off. We know the crab can do this sort of thing without hurting Konan, so Nagato should be able to host a damage-free wet Akatsuki cloak contest with the paths and make the Amaterasu a non-issue. That is, if we take the databook statement literally, and as we talked about before, we don't necessarily have to. Maybe you have a counter argument for why you think the Amaterasu could survive this jutsu, and that's totally fine. In fact, if you do, let me know down in the comments. I'm actually really curious to see how people react to this one. My main point in including this at all is just to make sure we're evaluating Pain's ability set as thoroughly as possible, and I mean it might actually just work the way the description says it does, which means that Itachi would have a much harder time making effective use of the Amaterasu, as long as the crab is alive, that is. Also, and I'm obviously partially joking with this, but technically speaking, the animal path can summon Konan too. Now obviously this is a debate about Itachi versus Pain, so I'm not going to seriously argue for Konan's participation. But technically speaking, the animal path could summon her in to tank one of the Amaterasu hits. This also makes me wonder if the animal path could just summon in Nagato. If so, and Nagato is able to summon in the Ghetto statue, then the battle suddenly changes dramatically. Remember, apart from everything else it can do, the Ghetto Mazo has that soul-stealing dragon ability that could potentially kill Itachi in one hit, so it's a serious threat. Not to mention that it just physically provides a large obstruction that Pain could potentially use for cover while, say, healing other paths with the Naraka path's ability. Since we're already talking about the summons, this would be a good place to address Noodles' claim that Itachi blinded all of the animal summons with Kunai during the Edo fight. Again, this never happened. The only summons that were even out on the field at the time were the Chameleon, who only had one functioning eye, if you don't count the ones on the snake head tail thing, and the King of Hell, which can't fucking move. The Chameleon was also standing still, holding Naruto in place, while Nagato was trying to rip Naruto's soul out with the human path. What Noodles is describing here just did not happen. That being said, Itachi has some pretty insane kunai feats, stretching all the way back to when he was a kid. In addition to all the other amazing stuff he pulls off as a shinobi in general, he's portrayed as being extraordinarily gifted in the use of kunai and shuriken specifically. Kabuto mentions that Itachi is able to launch his kunai from blind spots to hit his opponents before they even see them coming. However, he does this from cover against enemies that are distracted and engage with other targets. So Itachi's shuriken and kunai effectiveness is gonna vary based on the terrain and based on whether or not his opponents are distracted. Just to expand on that, remember, if Itachi is going up against all the summons at once, that would be the bird, the panda, the rhino, the bull, the centipede, the crab, the chameleon, and the dog. If we say that the first 6 of those have 2 eyes apiece, and the chameleon has 1 good eye after the Jiraiya fight, that's 13 targets in total. The dog can split up into multiple bodies. If we assume that ability maxes out at 10 bodies, that's 20 additional eyes. So to completely blind all the animal summons, Itachi would have to simultaneously hit up to 33 targets on individual moving bodies while they're attacking him. Maybe you think he can do that based on his other kunai feats, and that's fine, but this is obviously completely different from hitting 3 stationary targets who were distracted at close range. The Preta Path is able to absorb any chakra it comes into contact with, and as Swag mentions, it doesn't seem to need to be directly facing the chakra source to do so. It also seems to be able to drain a massive amount of chakra in a matter of seconds, absorbing the Rasen shuriken in flight and draining Naruto of all his sage chakra very quickly. It's also able to absorb all the boiling oil from Palma and Jiraiya's jutsu very quickly as well. It should also be able to absorb any Amaterasu it comes into contact with. For reference, here's the databook entry from the 3rd databook on page 296. The Preta Path's chakra absorption ability is described as an endless whirlpool that sucks away every jutsu. Every jutsu, regardless of its chakra properties, is sucked in and rendered ineffective. But the catch is, he needs to actually come into contact with it. The wave of boiling oil is essentially one continuous mass, but the same is not true of the Amaterasu or of flames in general. If the Preta Path ran around like Kirby in a very cursed gourmet race, he'd be able to absorb any of the flames that he physically touched. But unless he has some sort of vacuum-like ability, like Danzo's Tapir summon, some way of actively pulling all the Amaterasu flames off their targets and towards him, then he'd have to do a lot of maneuvering to put them all out. So in other words, the Preta Path would have a difficult time absorbing an entire battlefield's worth of Amaterasu, but that has more to do with its ability to maneuver around the battlefield than its ability to absorb the jutsu in and of itself. However, this is only really relevant if Itachi can actually light the entire battlefield on fire, and we've already talked about why that doesn't quite work. As a counterpoint though, another thing to consider is that Edo Nagato didn't absorb the Amaterasu on him, he pushed it off. And Madara also doesn't absorb Sasuke's Amaterasu, he takes off his armor. I wonder if we're supposed to look at that and conclude that absorbing the flames is just a bad idea. Like, maybe they keep on burning and just engulf the user after they're absorbed, or start burning inside them or something like that. We see the Amaterasu pushed off, but never actually absorbed. I think it's worth entertaining the idea that maybe there's a specific reason for that. We've talked about the fact that the Amaterasu doesn't burn down its targets instantly, but actually measuring the amount of time it takes to incinerate someone with the jutsu is pretty tricky. We do have one useful metric though, and that's Edo Nagato. When he gets tagged by Amaterasu used by Edo Itachi, he falls to the ground and lays there while Naruto, Bee, and Itachi have an extended conversation about Shisui and the Kodowa Matsukami. For context, remember, Kabuto is partially in control of Nagato at this point, meaning he's issuing him commands but hasn't fully suppressed his personality. It's also important to remember that Kabuto isn't necessarily as skilled at commanding Pain's abilities as Pain would be himself. He's actively trying to recall all of Nagato's skill set throughout the fight, and seems to have briefly forgotten about stuff like the Chibaku Tensei. Anyway, when Nagato gets hit with the Amaterasu, Kabuto basically just lets him lay there on the ground, burning away, while eavesdropping on the Shisui conversation. Then, the moment he's gotten the intel he was listening for, he immediately blows the Amaterasu off with Shinra Tensei, fully suppresses Nagato's personality, and sicks him on the trio. In that time, the Amaterasu has burned through one of Nagato's arms and some of his clothing, but obviously not his whole body. So that gives us a rough estimate of how long it takes for the Amaterasu to burn through a human body. Noodles interprets all this as Nagato being incapable of blowing off the Amaterasu in time, like the ability is locked out or something. He says Nagato physically couldn't do it, but there are no statements and no evidence demonstrating that to be the case. We do know that the Shinra Tensei has a base cooldown of 5 seconds. We see Nagato use the Shinra Tensei when B throws one of his blades at him, so you could argue that a 5-second cooldown timer starts there. From that point forward, there's a sequence where the crow lands on Naruto, Itachi and Nagato have an exchange, and Itachi uses Amaterasu on the dog, and then turns around and uses it on the bird, which hits Nagato. That whole chain of events takes at least a couple of seconds, since we see the characters standing still and talking to one another. And then they proceed to have the extended conversation about Shisui, which goes on for several pages. So even if the Shinra Tensei was still on cooldown the moment that Nagato first got hit with Amaterasu, it would have been well into that 5-second period, and whatever time remained in that countdown would absolutely have run out within the first few words of the Shisui Discord call. It's also worth noting that the Amaterasu flames don't spread to the surrounding grass, ground, or forest, and after Nagato's been lying on the ground for the duration of that whole conversation, only one of Nagato's arms has actually burned up. When we look at all this, it's very clear that the Amaterasu takes a while to burn down its targets. So any statements to the effect that Itachi could instantly vaporize any of Pain's paths or the animals are just demonstrably not true. Now let's touch on that statement that not all Amaterasu are created equally. We do see that the Amaterasu can be cast with different sizes. As for whether the smaller ones cost less chakra or cause less eye strain than the larger ones, I think that intuitively makes sense, but again, proving it is kinda difficult. It could be, for example, that the way the user's eye is focused determines the size and shape of the fireball, but that the jutsu always has like a base minimum cost. In other words, I'm wondering if the flames are passing through the user's eye and the eye is functioning like a lens and just changing the way that the flame is sized and skewed, but the actual energy being output for each cast is always the same. Most of the Amaterasu casts in the series, up through the Edo Nagato fight anyway, are around the same size, with notable exceptions being the one Sasuke used on B and the one Itachi used on his own crow. In the debate, Noodle suggested that Itachi's first cast against Sasuke was a massive Amaterasu, but Swag brought up that it might have been enhanced by being cast alongside Itachi's active fireball jutsu, and then it just quickly balloons in size even more as it engulfs Sasuke's own fireball jutsu. I'm with Swag on this one. We're shown elsewhere in the series that jutsu can combine and enhance one another, and we also get a brief shot of the Amaterasu core when it's first cast here. It's pretty clear that it's rapidly expanding, rather than Itachi just having cast one massive Amaterasu from the get-go. The other thing we need to consider is whether cancelling out or extinguishing an Amaterasu is as fatiguing as casting one in the first place. It's true, it's still a Mangekyo-ai ability either way, but we're not given any concrete information about how fatiguing it is to put out the flames. I mean, it could potentially be more straining to turn the flames off than to ignite them depending on the context. For example, Itachi setting his own crow on fire might be less taxing than Sasuke putting out all the flames on B, if we assume that the strain on one's eyes is proportional to the size of the flame. My personal feeling is that since it's an ocular ability that involves using the Mangekyo to manipulate the Amaterasu, then yes, it'll put some strain on the user's eye by definition. But since the Amaterasu involves building up chakra in the eye and then releasing it as a jutsu, and the extinguishing is essentially just halting the jutsu in its tracks or releasing it, I'm leaning towards turning it on being more taxing than turning it off. As a rough analogy, do you think it costs Naruto more chakra to release a shadow clone than to summon one in the first place? It's obviously not a one-to-one analogy, but categorically, releasing jutsu is usually far less fatiguing than conjuring them in the first place, so it's worth thinking about. That all segues nicely into a conversation about how many times Itachi gets to use his Mangekyo abilities before he runs out of chakra or goes blind during a fight against Pain. The major drawback of the Mangekyo is that repeated use eventually leads to the user losing their vision and consequently the ability to use dojutsu entirely. We see Itachi's vision declining over the fight with Sasuke as a direct consequence of his dojutsu use. So how many total uses of Amaterasu would he get to use against Pain before losing his sight? Let's keep a couple of important considerations in mind here. For one, the Amaterasu is cast using one eye and the Tsukuyomi is cast using the other. It's possible for Itachi to blind himself in one eye by spamming Amaterasu, but still potentially be able to use the Tsukuyomi after the fact, as long as he has enough chakra. We actually see this in the Sasuke fight. One of his eyes fades out and goes grey, and loses its Mangekyo pattern after using Amaterasu multiple times in a row. On the other hand, Susanoo and its associated abilities, like the Sword of Totsuka and Yaramir, seem to be available regardless of the user's blindness. Itachi is able to keep his Susanoo active even after both his eyes go grey. That all being said, using these jutsu, independently of the blinding effect, consumes a ton of chakra and can be inherently heavily fatiguing. So even if we were to say Itachi gets 10 uses of Amaterasu and 3 casts of Tsukuyomi for example, please understand that at that point, in addition to being blinded, Itachi would be heavily fatigued and low on chakra. We know from Kakashi's use of Kamui that overusing the Mangekyo when your chakra is depleted can directly lead to death. So just be aware that Itachi wouldn't be able to use like 10 Amaterasu as an opening salvo and then still be fresh for the rest of the fight. On that note, the Amaterasu's effects appear to be progressive, so it's not like Itachi would get 10 casts and then suddenly go blind. His vision will deteriorate more and more with each use, so it'd become harder for him to accurately target his enemies the more times he casts Amaterasu, and that would, of course, have an effect on his overall combat performance, not just on the accuracy of the Amaterasu itself. And just to be totally clear, we do know for a fact that Itachi goes blind with repeated Mangekyo use. In addition to Itachi's own statements about how the Mangekyo progresses towards darkness from the moment they're awakened, and the Uchiha history he shares with Sasuke, which includes stuff like Madara getting Izuna's eyes to stave off his own blindness, we also just straight up see Sasuke through Itachi's point of view at the start of the fight, and it's clearly faded, skewed, and distorted. After Itachi uses the Tsukuyomi, his vision seems to get even worse, and he has to focus and expend effort to resolve his double vision. Add this all to the fact that his eyes go grey after using more Mangekyo Jutsu later in the fight, and the clear implication is that he's progressively and rapidly losing his vision with every jutsu cast. I mean, maybe he's not completely blind because he can still make his way over to Sasuke to bonk him on the forehead, but his vision is definitely way worse by the end of the fight. We also see that Sasuke gradually loses his vision after he awakens the Mangekyo. He knocks over that glass after the B fight, which implies he's lost some depth perception. After the 5 Kage Summit and the Danzo fight, we see Kakashi and Naruto through Sasuke's point of view, and they're both blurry and grayed out. Obito also says that Sasuke has nearly lost his vision after that encounter, which is part of what motivates Sasuke to finally implant Itachi's eyes. So yes, we have ample evidence showing that the Mangekyo degrades your vision. None of this should really come as a surprise, with stuff like the Amaterasu causing blood to leak from the eyes of the user. Okay, so anyway, how do we get an estimate of how many times Itachi can use dojutsu in the Pain fight? Well, in the debate, Swag suggested that they go through and look at every use of Amaterasu and tally them up. I think he meant over the course of the Itachi vs Sasuke fight, but I'm going to do you one better. I made a list of all the uses of Mangekyo Jutsu from both Sasuke and Itachi up until the end of the 5 Kage Summit. We'll start with Itachi. How many times do we see him use Amaterasu throughout the series? He uses it once when he and Kisame are inside Jiraiya's toad. He uses it again during the fireball clash with Sasuke. He uses it 3 times on top of the Uchiha hideout, which Sasuke dodges. And then he uses one more, the last one we ever see him use while alive, and that's the one that tags Sasuke on his wing. Well, technically there's one more, the one that Itachi implants into Sasuke that gets automatically triggered on Obito, but I'm not sure whether to count that for Sasuke or for Itachi. You know what, to make things interesting, let's say that programmed Amaterasu does count for Itachi. Let's even say that each of the times Itachi turns off the Amaterasu against Sasuke, that'd be 2 times, those would count as additional casts of Amaterasu against Pain. That would mean that Itachi gets at max 8 casts of Amaterasu that he can use in a fight against Pain before going blind and losing access to abilities in that eye. That's 8 casts against 6 paths and 8 animal summons. As for the Tsukuyomi, Itachi used one on Kid Sasuke the night he wiped out the Uchiha village, one on Kid Sasuke again in the Jiraiya fight in the hotel, one on Kakashi, and then one more on Hebi Sasuke. So if we're being strict, we should probably say that Itachi only gets to use 1 Tsukuyomi and 5 Amaterasu on Pain. But if you want to be more creative and have more fun with it, you could say, okay, he gets a couple of Tsukuyomi, he gets 8 or 9 Amaterasu uses, let's just say he gets 10 Mangekyo abilities, and this is apart from just having his Mangekyo active and doing stuff like using the Susanoo. Do you think that's fair? I gave you the data so you know where I'm coming from here. Giving 5 Amaterasu and 1 Tsukuyomi would be the most accurate scaling to his status at the Uchiha hideout, but 10 would make the fight more interesting and would allow for more wiggle room in our interpretations. For comparison, I think it's actually useful to look at how many times Sasuke uses the Amaterasu before he goes blind. We don't get to see how many times Itachi uses his dojutsu off panel, of course. I think we know for sure he uses it once based off Danzo's comment in 477, but that's all we know for sure. But with Sasuke on the other hand, we get to observe him from the moment he gets his Mangekyo to the point where he's nearly lost his vision entirely. For the sake of argument this time, let's say that the auto-triggered Amaterasu counts as 1 use for Sasuke. With that one being included, how many total uses of Amaterasu does Sasuke get before he starts losing his vision? He uses 1 to set B on fire, he extinguishes the one on Karin, and then he extinguishes the larger one on B. He then uses Amaterasu on the Raikage, he uses a second on his own Susanoo. When he uses flame control, it's not technically another Amaterasu, but he is grabbing his eye and he's manipulating the flame, so let's just call it 1 more cast. Then in chapter 464, it's kinda hard to tell how many he uses on Gaara. It might be 2 or 3, so let's just say 3 for the sake of argument. And then finally, he uses 1 against Danzo in chapter 477. And that's it for his Amaterasu uses before he gets Itachi's eyes. Immediately after this, we see the progression of his blindness. In chapter 482, Obito tells Sasuke, you overused your ocular powers and your eyes are losing their sight. By chapter 484, Sasuke has had his Mangekyo active while up against Kakashi. His eyes fade to gray and Kakashi's outline through Sasuke's point of view becomes blurry. By chapter 487, we see another panel of Naruto through Sasuke's POV, and he's all blurry as well. Obito confirms that Sasuke is almost blind at that point. So at most, including extinguishing the flames and assuming that he did actually use 3 separate charges on Gaara, Sasuke gets around 10 or 11 casts of Mangekyo Jutsu before going blind. To be clear though, remember that using the Susanoo causes eye strain, not just the Amaterasu, and while Sasuke doesn't use the Tsukuyomi, he does use Mangekyo Genjutsu a couple of times. Like during the B fight, he clearly has his Mangekyo active and he winds up grasping his eye after using a Genjutsu, so it's clearly causing him some strain, though how it compares to a full-on Tsukuyomi isn't made explicit. And keep in mind, this is over the course of multiple fights wherein Sasuke gets severely wounded, has his chakra restored by Karin and White Zetsu, gets saved by Obito, etc. So if Sasuke gets 10 or 11 uses with fresh eyes, then there's no way Itachi gets any more than that against Pain. I think maybe saying he only gets 5, like Swag is suggesting, is a little bit stingy. Maybe 10 is too much. How about 8? How about he gets 8 Mangekyo charges against Pain? It's tempting to argue that Itachi could spam the Amaterasu on Tendo back to back and at least melt him down and take him out of the fight. However, remember that Tendo gets to use a Shinra Tensei every 5 seconds, so even if Itachi was focus firing on him with Amaterasu at every possible opportunity, Tendo would have several opportunities to counter it. If Itachi got 8 casts of Amaterasu and he used them all on Tendo back to back after each Shinra Tensei, that would amount to 40 seconds of total burn time, right? Assuming, of course, that nothing else got in the way. If the Amaterasu Itachi used on Edo Nagato only managed to get through one of his arms during that long conversation about Shisui, which clearly took at least a minute if you just read out what the characters are saying, what reason do we have to believe that the Amaterasu would burn through Tendo's whole body in 40 seconds, especially if it's getting interrupted every 5 seconds? We know that when Edo Tensei characters are resurrected, they're often brought back with some of the same physical limitations they had when they were alive. Examples include the third Raikage's scar, Chiyo being brought back as an old lady, or Nagato appearing in chakra-drained form with limited mobility. But I have a question, was Kimimaro brought back sick? In other words, was the body that Kimimaro's soul was placed into via the Edo Tensei also afflicted with whatever illness he was suffering from when he was alive? And if so, how was that sickness actually affecting his body? As a brief refresher on how the Edo Tensei works, it's a form of summoning jutsu where an individual's soul is summoned from the Pure Land and made to possess the body of another person, who's used as a sacrifice and a vessel for the jutsu. The reason the vessel then resembles the summoned person, including their clothing and gear, is because a layer of ash starts to cover the vessel and this takes on the summoned soul's appearance. It also inherits their chakra nature and overall abilities. What Kabuto says specifically is that the individuals are revived with all the abilities they had during life. The reason Nagato is in the state that he's in goes back to his fight with Hanzo. When he summons the Geto statue, his body is pierced with chakra rods, and it's implied that his life force is being drained to power the soul-stealing dragon jutsu, or maybe just to power the statue itself. Nagato starts to look gaunt and emaciated then and there, and this carries on throughout his life. His life force is then drained even further when he uses the Rinne Rebirth after having previously used the massive Shinra Tensei and Chibaku Tensei. Obito actually has a statement about this in chapter 510. He says, "You exerted so much power that your red hair, proof of your Uzumaki clan lineage, turned white." Nagato isn't suffering from some wasting illness. He's not sick, he's just strained his body to the point where he can't properly use it anymore from using powerful jutsu. I'm not sure if he's even been able to walk on his own even before becoming an Edo Tensei for a very long time, and that's why he comes back in this state. See also in chapter 499, when Naruto finally manages to pull out Kurama's chakra, note that Kurama himself takes on the same gaunt, thin, frail appearance that Nagato has. Depicting characters as faded or emaciated is part of a visual language telling us that they've been drained in some way, but it's not a physical ailment, it's something less literal, something to do with their use of chakra. Another relevant example is from the Sage Kabuto fight. Edo Itachi actually appears to lose vision in one of his eyes after he uses Izanami. That eye never regenerates and is still grayed out when Itachi's soul leaves his Edo Tensei body, but he's still able to use Mangekyo abilities throughout his fight with Nagato and Kabuto, and to regenerate from major damage as well. So it's not just that his eye's been injured, it's been, I don't know what the right word for it is, sealed, drained, chakra sapped? Anyway, that's why it never regenerates. Physical damage gets restored, but more esoteric effects might not be. I couldn't find any statements indicating that a physical illness, like a virus or a cancer, would somehow persist within someone's soul within the Pure Land, and then be brought back with them into the impure world and infect its host body. And even if it did, consider that Kabuto is the one casting the Edo Tensei in the war arc, and he's advanced the binding to the strongest point it's ever been in the series to date. He's also an extremely skilled medical ninja, and is specifically skilled at manipulating and altering corpses. It just doesn't make sense that he would bring back someone with an illness and not have some countermeasure for it, or at least that he would never once mention that being a concern. And anyway, even if they were brought back sick, how would that actually affect their performance? If Edo Tensei are constantly regenerating any damage they take, wouldn't that apply to any damage being done to their bodies by an illness as well? One last thing here before we move on. The debaters claim that Itachi was brought back at a point in time before he went blind. That's not how the Edo Tensei works either. Kabuto is summoning their souls from the Pure Land, like I mentioned. He doesn't get to just roll back their clock to whatever time is convenient for him. He just summons them, and they appear as they were before they died. The only exception to this is Madara, but he's explicitly stated to be a special case that required significant modification on Kabuto's behalf. Sasori is another exception, in that he was brought back with his actual body instead of as a lump of flesh in a box. But the running theme here is that characters will be brought back with the overall appearance and overall ability set that they had when they were alive. But things like open wounds and illnesses won't be carried over. I mean, Haku doesn't show up as an Edo with a gaping hole in his chest either, right? I'll clarify here why Obito didn't attack the village. Spoiler alert, it wasn't because he was piss scared of Itachi, whatever that means. Obito made a pact with Itachi. Itachi was a valuable, useful member of the Akatsuki, and that continued to be the case as long as that pact was maintained, which meant leaving both Sasuke and the village unharmed. It's made pretty clear that Obito sees Itachi as a tool rather than a comrade. In Obito's own words, Sharingan that actually acquire the Susanoo are rare. I like to stalk good eyes. Itachi was inherently a valuable asset to Obito, but that would only apply if Obito honored his side of the pact. Obito eventually came to the conclusion that Sasuke would be a more valuable asset than Itachi for a variety of reasons. Itachi was sick, dying, and was planning on sacrificing himself for Sasuke anyway. Sasuke could then be groomed to hate to actively want to annihilate Konoha without question, unlike his reluctant brother. And finally, and probably most importantly, Obito recognized an opportunity for Sasuke to not only nurture his own Mangekyo Sharingan by killing Itachi, but then also to be able to inherit Itachi's eyes and awaken the eternal Mangekyo Sharingan, which would ultimately be a much more valuable asset for Obito's designs. Whether or not you think Obito is physically stronger than Itachi, I personally think he is, but that's another debate. He is the mastermind behind the Akatsuki's operations in its current state. This is summarized perfectly in a panel in chapter 539, where Itachi says to Nagato, "We were both being used, they only kept us around for our ocular powers." The they he is referring to here is Obito and Zetsu. And in chapter 545, Obito outright states that he controls people by manipulating the darkness in their hearts. Obito sees Nagato and Itachi as useful agents with hearts shrouded in darkness, and is thus able to take advantage of that darkness to use both of them for his purposes, until they've outlived their usefulness, that is. Obito was never afraid of Itachi. He used Itachi as part of a long game scheme to acquire a more powerful set of Mangekyo Sharingan for his own arsenal. He also actively did not want to attack the Leaf Village again until he was essentially ready to go to war, because A, provoking Konoha could lead to them retaliating and escalating the conflict into a full-on war against the Akatsuki before he was ready, and B, the reason for attacking Konoha in the first place was to get the Nine Tails, and Obito and the Akatsuki needed to collect the other Biju first in order to maintain the balance of chakra within the Gedo statue. At a certain point in the debate, Noodles starts talking about one of Itachi's jutsu that apparently has the ability to create infinitely sized 4D time spaces. Itachi is then able to shove these time spaces into the minds of his opponents, which overloads and destroys their psyche. Now, I was confused at first. I'm pretty familiar with Itachi's skill set, and I hadn't heard of anything like this, but I eventually figured out the source of the confusion. See, Noodles is describing an ability called the Tsukuyomi. Apparently, the Tsukuyomi functions similarly to another ability called Gojo's Infinity. So, Gojo is a character from another anime called Jujutsu Kaisen, or JJK. I'm not an expert on JJK, so I'm referencing the wiki here. Gojo does have an ability called Infinity, which is like a barrier of infinitely subdivided space that prevents people from touching him. To quote the wiki, anything that attempts to penetrate this infinitely divided space will slow down to the point of appearing to stop completely. So nothing here has anything to do with alternate realities or time spaces. Gojo has a separate ability called Unlimited Void. To quote the wiki again, this ability traps the target inside the concept of infinity, inundating them with an endless stream of information, overloading their brains, and leaving them in a catatonic state. Gojo isn't creating an entirely new universe here. He's drawing his opponents into the limitless, which has the appearance of an infinite void. None of this matches up to the Tsukuyomi that Noodles is describing. Going back to Naruto, the distinction between drawing people into something and creating an entirely new time space is crucial to understand here. The creation of an entirely new time space is an extremely rare ability. Presumably, the Kamui dimension counts as a time space, as well as probably things like Orochimaru's space where he absorbs victims for soul transference, but neither of those are depicted as being infinite in size. Even Kaguya's dimensions are said to be incredibly vast, but not infinite. Kaguya is essentially a god as well, and when she starts to create a new time space towards the end of the series, the amount of chakra that's being used to make it is portrayed as being borderline unbelievable. Itachi does not have the ability to make new universes. He does not have an ability called the Tsukuyomi. What he does have is an ability called the Tsukuyomi. The Tsukuyomi is a Genjutsu, and Genjutsu are illusion techniques. Like we talked about before, illusion techniques work by tricking their opponent's minds and senses. The illusory time-space the victim finds themselves trapped in is a manifestation of their own mind being manipulated by the caster. It's described as a mental world in the databooks, but it's not literally an alternate dimension that gets instantiated and put into someone's head. It's a figurative nightmare realm, and it's all taking place inside the target's mind. When the databook says it annihilates one's heart and soul, that is, once again, figurative language meant to illustrate the devastating emotional and psychological impact of the jutsu, but the nightmare landscape of the Tsukuyomi is not an alternate dimension, it's an illusion. The positive claim for us to test here is whether Itachi can run around with a full Susanoo active, with the Yaramir and Totsuka blade equipped, and whether he could chase around and kill all the paths of pain one by hitting them with the Totsuka blade. The thing is, we don't really see characters moving like this with the full Susanoo active until people like Madara start showing up with fully formed Susanoo with legs and wings. We see Itachi moving forward slowly with his full Susanoo active, and we see him jumping around in the Edo Nagato fight with a partially formed Susanoo up, but we never see him move at full speed with his complete Susanoo deployed. To be fair, I couldn't find any statements declaring that he definitively couldn't do this, but keep in mind here that the Susanoo is essentially a large, dense mass of chakra. It stands to reason that even if Itachi could move at full speed under the Susanoo, it would put more strain on him to do so. It's also worth considering the visual design of the Susanoo. It's large, bulky, and dome-like, and takes on the appearance of a hunkered-down armored warrior. The Yaramir itself is clearly designed to be used defensively. Together, the Susanoo and the Yaramir are thematically similar to Gaara's sand armor and sand shield combo, an ultimate defense that the user can move around with, but not something that's necessarily intended to be used in extended, speedy offensive maneuvers. And conversely, Gaara can move around with his sand shield and sand armor active, but Kankuro mentions that it's cumbersome and maintaining it takes a lot of effort. I think the same is true of the Susanoo as well. I mean, in chapter 479, when Danzo is up against Sasuke, Sasuke basically plants the Susanoo in place. He doesn't chase Danzo around with it. Danzo even says specifically that the Susanoo cannot move. In the Kabuto fight, Sasuke and Itachi once again essentially use the Susanoo in the same way, defensively. They reposition slightly, but for the most part, they tend to stay in position when their Susanoos are active. With that all being said, the Totsuka blade is definitely a powerful weapon, both in terms of its AP, we see it cut through Orochimaru's snakeheads like butter, and the databook says it can cut down any enemy. Of course, that's probably hyperbolic, but it's still worth noting. And in reference to the sealing jutsu it has, that was used to seal both Nagato and Orochimaru in a single thrust each. Furthermore, Itachi is able to cut through Edo Nagato's body with the arm of his incomplete Susanoo, let alone with the Totsuka blade, so when we put all that together, I think it's totally reasonable to assume he'd have the AP to damage the paths of pain. And unless the summons have more defense than Orochimaru's snakes, or the weapons the Toad summons use in the Pain vs. Naruto fight, Itachi should be able to damage or outright kill the summons too. However, this is only relevant if Itachi can actually hit his targets, and the Susanoo has an effective time limit in that it consumes a massive amount of chakra and places heavy strain on the eyes and body of the user, so Itachi would need to use this ability tactically just like any other. And if we don't take that databook statement literally, then that obviously changes how we view all this. Also, regarding the claim that the Sword of Totsuka would instantly seal any opponent, the way it's used, it's thrust forward and pierces an enemy. It then takes a few moments for the enemy's soul to be siphoned off and sucked into the gourd. Also, when it's used both on Orochimaru and Nagato, those targets are alone and are either distracted or have their mobility limited. We see in both instances that it takes a moment for the target to be sucked up and imprisoned into the gourd. We also need to consider whether the sealing effect would work the same way on the paths as it does on living characters. If it functions by sealing one's soul, we need to demonstrate that the paths and/or the animal summons actually have souls, which is something that Swag mentions in the debate. Noodles tried to respond to that by saying that, well, they have chakra, and chakra is made up of partially spiritual energy, and spirits are like souls, so they have souls too. But hopefully you can see the issue with that. It's a false equivalency at best. Souls, as presented in the Naruto Universe, aren't just concentrations of spiritual energy. And if the Totsuka blade works by sealing users in a Genjutsu world, then that would be an effect which would require cognition or perception of some kind, something a soul would have but raw spiritual energy would not. I could probably agree that Itachi could seal any individual target that he pierces with the blade, including any of the summons and any of the paths of pain up to and including Nagato, since Genjutsu do work on the paths. The drawback, however, is that once he starts sealing one of the paths in the gourd, he'd be vulnerable to counterattack, or at least tied up until the sealing process is complete. So this would be a great time to talk about the Yata Mirror, but surprisingly, I don't have all that much to say about it. It's obviously a powerful tool that would be an asset for Itachi that comes with the same caveats as the Susanoo itself in terms of chakra consumption and strain on Itachi's body and eyes. I do think the databook statements describing it are hyperbolic, but regardless, we know how durable Sasuke's incomplete Susanoo is on its own from its feats in the 5 Kage Summit, so it's only fair to assume that Itachi's full Susanoo would be even more durable when complete, and when you add the Yata Mirror on top of that, the thing is a tank. I'd probably argue that based on its raw durability alone, it will be able to resist any physical or ninjutsu based attack pain threw at it, including him just straight up dropping a Chibaku Tensei on his head, for as long as Itachi could keep it up, that is. However, to be clear, just like pretty much every other jutsu in the verse, there are pros and cons to using this technique. To reiterate, the Susanoo consumes a ton of chakra, and the longer Itachi uses it, the less chakra he has available for other abilities in the fight, including Amaterasu and Tsukuyomi. Sasuke also comments on how agonizing it is to maintain the Susanoo active for extended periods of time, saying that it feels like every cell in his body is in pain. He's basing those comments off his own incomplete Susanoo, and speculates that the pain must have been even worse for Itachi with his more advanced Susanoo. The third databook even gives us a statement that the jutsu can consume its caster. That same databook also provides some more insight into the way the Yata Mirror actually works. It's not just some magical hack. The Yata Mirror specifically negates incoming jutsu by changing its own elemental nature to counter the nature of an incoming jutsu. So if it makes contact with an incoming earth jutsu, it can change its nature to lightning and negate the attack. But I wonder, what would happen if an incoming attack has multiple different nature transformations, or if the Yata Mirror is hit simultaneously by several attacks with different natures? So, for example, let's say Kakashi throws a fireball at it, it changes its nature to water to cancel out the fire. Now Yamato throws an earth jutsu at it while Kakashi sustains the fireball. The Yata Mirror is already in water affinity mode, and water is weak to earth, so would that second attack be effective? Can the Yata Mirror use and combine multiple chakra natures simultaneously? I'm honestly not sure if there are clear answers to this, but I think it's worth considering since most, not all, but most of the jutsu, abilities, and systems in the Naruto universe are given clearly defined strengths and limitations. With very few exceptions, every jutsu has a weakness, even the one Kabuto spent a whole arc bragging about not having any weaknesses, the Edo Tensei, even stuff like the truth-seeking orbs, and even stuff like the Sword of Nunoboko, which Obito says was used by the Sage of Six Paths to create the world and is impossible to destroy. Sasuke and Naruto broke it anyway. So I would advocate for allowing ourselves some flexibility with the databook definitions. We should be considering things like the Yata Mirror as a part of that same set of abilities and systems in the verse. And in that context, I think it's more accurate to see the Yata Mirror not as some omnipotent trump card, but as a powerful weapon that uses elemental negation and the strength of Itachi's chakra to render itself virtually invincible, but not entirely invincible. Also, if we're gonna accept at face value statements like the Yata Mirror repelling literally any attack, and the Sword of Kotsuka being able to cut down literally any enemy, I'd just like to quickly reference some databook entries from Pain's abilities. For the Naraka path and the King of Hell, specifically its ability to pull someone's soul out, we have this statement. The force is brought out the instant the user touches someone. It is impossible to resist. Once grabbed, the person has only death ahead of them. So if we're taking these databook statements literally, as long as Pain can touch Itachi with the Naraka path, this is a one-shot kill. We went over the human path's ability to rip out souls in an earlier section, but as a quick recap, I'll just quote this line from the databook. A person's end comes when the hand is placed over his head, even if the victim tries to resist, etc., etc. A power that is almost a divine miracle. Again, if we take this literally, all Pain has to do is grab onto Itachi's head and he's done for. For the Bansho Tenin, a power that is absolutely inevitable. The divine palm that attracts everything in creation. The jutsu attracts any matter that exists. Any matter that makes up the target is forcibly pulled towards the palm of the right hand. These are the final moments of the target, since there are no ways to try to resist. Everyone is bowing to this gravitational attraction. To summarize all that, we could argue that all Pain needs to do to defeat Itachi is to use the Bancho Tenin to pull him in, and remember there is no way to try to resist this, so the Susanoo wouldn't help. While he's being sucked in, on top of all the other animal summons and the Asura and animal paths themselves, Pain can maneuver the Preta path into position to drain the Susanoo of its chakra, the Naraka path can be put into position to rip out Itachi's soul, the human path could be put into position as a backup to do the same thing, and remember, these abilities have no counters according to the databooks, so that means that Pain's victory is guaranteed, right? Obviously, there's room for nuance here. We could have a discussion about whether or not Pain would be able to pull off these maneuvers at all, for one. We could talk about whether the Bancho Tenin, for example, would require more chakra to pull in Itachi if Itachi had his Susanoo up, and if that would make Pain more vulnerable after the fact. There's plenty of room for debate. I personally think we should take these databook statements with a grain of salt. But if you're going to insist on taking the Yaramir and Totsuka Blade statements literally, there's no reason not to take these statements about Pain literally as well. And at that point, we have just as much evidence for Pain being able to one-shot and annihilate Itachi as we do for Itachi being able to do the same with the Susanoo. The reality is this: regardless of how hyped up the databook statements are, fights in the Naruto series, yes, even fights involving supposedly omnipotent abilities, are complex things that happen in complex ways. This fight isn't some Pokemon-style turn-based exchange of attacks. It's more like a complicated dance with all kinds of moving parts. It's not just about how strong the abilities are, it's about how they're used. So I was debating whether or not to cut this part out, but I decided to include it because it's one of those arguments that seems simple on the surface, but is actually kind of tricky when you break it down. To summarize the argument, Swag claims that Kakashi is light speed because he reacts to Itachi's Water Fang bullet, which the databook lists as having bullets at the speed of light. Noodles counters by saying that since Itachi was holding back, that he used a hypothetical slower version of the jutsu on Kakashi, and that the Water Fang bullet mentioned in the databook is essentially another version of the attack. He also confuses Water Fang bullet with Water Gun, which is the jutsu exclusive to Hozuki clan members. There's surprisingly a lot to talk about here. To start off with, the description of the Water Fang bullet in the second databook reads, "Lightning fast bullets, gathered from water, they come out of a blind spot and gore the enemy." So the bullets themselves are lightning fast and not the speed of light. And lightning is several orders of magnitude, hundreds of thousands of times, slower than light. There are several other jutsu that are translated by fans from the Japanese as being the speed of light, but you'll often find that the official English translations render them as being lightning fast or quick as a flash. Of course, the official translations aren't perfect, but I think this sheds some light on the intention behind the original descriptions. Getting back to the Water Fang bullet specifically, it's important to note that this light speed statement is referring to the bullets themselves. The jutsu has two components to it: these spiral structures that emerge out of the water that twist and wind up to apply pressure to the water inside, which is then released as fast-moving projectiles. The databook only says that the bullets travel at the speed of light once fired. That doesn't mean that the jutsu casting speed or the wind-up time are light speed as well, in the same way that someone's finger pulling the trigger on a rifle is not as fast as the bullet that comes out of the rifle. What all this means is that it's not necessarily the case that the bullets are moving at the speed of light, but even if they are, the fact that Kakashi reacted to them doesn't mean he's moving at the speed of light either, since he can start reacting and preparing his water wall as a counter the moment he sees Itachi start to cast the jutsu, and he's got until the jets finish spooling up to get his defenses up. As another example of this, there's a statement that Haku can move between his mirrors at the speed of light. You may or may not take this literally, but regardless, check out chapter 521. Haku himself may move between his mirrors at light speed, but it still takes him a minute to set the mirrors up. Sai is able to notice this happening and respond to it and intercept his attack. Sai doesn't need to be the speed of light to pull this feat off, because the fact that the ice mirror transport might be light speed doesn't mean the setup is light speed as well. The same principle applies to the Water Fang bullet projectiles and the water spouts. Now, as for the claim that Itachi could have used a slower version of the jutsu, this implies that the jutsu has the ability to be scaled down in speed at all. The databook just gives us a specific baseline speed for the jutsu. So if Noodles is making this as a positive claim, He needs to demonstrate that the Water Fang bullet can be scaled down in speed in the first place, and then he needs to demonstrate that Itachi is actually doing so here. The only evidence that Noodles provides for any of this is that Itachi was holding back against Kakashi, so the Water Fang bullet must have been slower, but this is a total non sequitur. The fact that Itachi is holding back overall doesn't mean that every jutsu he uses is slowed down. For example, when Itachi's fighting Sasuke, he's also holding back in that fight. Does that mean that Itachi is using a version of the Amaterasu that travels more slowly and burns less hot? Can the Amaterasu be given arbitrary temperature and speed like that? The fact that a character is holding back overall doesn't mean that all their jutsu are arbitrarily scaled down in intensity. Itachi also could have just specifically chosen to use the Water Fang bullet because he thought Kakashi could survive it. That would still be in keeping with him holding back against Kakashi. He just picks an attack that he thinks Kakashi can react to, and it turns out that he's right. If Itachi has any intel at all about Kakashi's fight against Zabuza, then he'd know that Kakashi is specifically adept at reacting to and countering water-type jutsu, so this wouldn't be out of character for him at all. Itachi could also just have not been aiming for Kakashi's vital points, in which case he might have wanted the bullets to be traveling at max speed to help ensure that they hit Kakashi as precisely as possible. The more time Kakashi has to react, the greater the chance of Itachi missing and unintentionally doing lethal damage. These are all viable reasons why the Water Fang bullet Itachi used could have been used at full speed while Itachi is holding back against Kakashi overall. These two things are not mutually exclusive in any way. Also in chapter 555, Kabuto is sending the third Raikage up against Naruto. Kabuto specifically wants to capture Naruto alive to gain access to the Nine Tails. He says he's going to bring Naruto in half dead. He nonetheless has the Raikage use Hell Thrust in its strongest form when he attacks Naruto. This is a perfect example of how you can still use the most powerful version of an attack against someone while still holding back overall. To wrap up this section, let me conclude by addressing whether the Water Fang bullet we see in the databook is the same one that Itachi used. It absolutely, definitely is the same one. Itachi is the only listed user of the Water Fang bullet, and we only see the Water Fang bullet used once in the entire series, here in the Itachi vs Kakashi fight. There's another jutsu that we see used a couple of times called the Water Gun. The Water Gun is the technique unique to the Hozuki clan members like Gengetsu and Suigetsu. In fact, the fourth databook clarifies that only people who are able to transform themselves into water, like Suigetsu, can use this jutsu, and that water transformation ability is a Hozuki clan exclusive. So Itachi has never used Water Gun because he literally physically cannot do so. The only time we ever see the Water Fang bullet used in the series is when Itachi uses it on Kakashi. So to be clear, yes, the databook entry is absolutely referring to that fight. For my final point on Itachi, I'd just like to respond to the claim that Itachi is by far the strongest character mentioned in the databooks at that point in the series. To address this claim, I will list other characters who are mentioned in the third databook: Hashirama, Tobirama, Madara, the Sage of Six Paths, and Pain. And finally, we have to deal with the scummiest argument in the whole debate. The cognitive dissonance on display here is almost impressive. I'm sorry if I sound harsh here, but this dishonest, distracting, shell game, sleight-of-hand bullshit contributes absolutely nothing to a debate. It just derails the whole discussion. It was honestly pretty baffling to see this play out. Let me break down the arguments and explain why this is so bad. Swag starts off by referring to this statement from a weekly release that refers to Pain as the strongest Akatsuki member and says that he's going off in pursuit of Naruto. We'll call statements like these hype statements. According to the debaters, they may be written by editors for the weekly releases and don't appear in the volume releases. I actually hadn't seen these at all before they were brought up in the debate because I've always read the volumes. Anyway, Noodles counters by pointing at the following statement that reads, "Next time, in pursuit of Itachi." He argues that the quote-unquote strongest Akatsuki member statement is referring to Itachi. To support this, he jumps to midway through the next week's release to a panel showing Itachi walking through the forest and claims that Itachi is hiding in the bushes looking for Naruto. Swag then points to the hype statement on that panel that says pure coincidence that shows Itachi and Naruto only bumped into each other by happenstance. And then Noodles looks at that and says, well, we don't know for a fact that that was written by Kishimoto. It could have been written by an editor, and since we don't know who wrote it, we can't trust it, and we can't use it. If you are going to use hype statements for your own argument, you can't then say that your opponent can't use hype statements categorically for their argument. That's just plain hypocrisy. Establish a rule and stick to it. Either you can use hype statements or you can't, or ideally establish a more nuanced rule. You can use them for context, but not accept them at face value, just like databook statements. It's actually painfully clear who these statements are referring to, and whether or not they're accurate if you just read the chapters they're shown in. On the panel where Pain is shown, he has just been having a conversation about how he's going to go get the Nine Tails. He is literally, in that moment, setting off in pursuit of Naruto. The text referring to the strongest Akatsuki member pursuing Naruto is literally right there underneath the guy who's pursuing Naruto. It's right there. The next time in Pursuit of Itachi statement is referring to other events and other characters that are not on this panel. I can't believe I have to explain this stuff. The characters in the next chapter are in Pursuit of Itachi, and we'll get to them in a second. The strongest Akatsuki member statement, on the other hand, is something we can dig into a little more. This scene is from many chapters before the Naruto and Pain fight, a long time before we really learn about Obito's true nature, and about the extent of his powers, for example. And this point in the series, we readers have all been led to believe that Pain is the strongest Akatsuki member. The statement is clearly playing off of the audience's expectations and understandings of the characters at that point in time. Like, did you ever watch Dragon Ball Z as a kid? You'd get these hype statements at the end of the episode, like, in the next episode, Vegeta faces off against the invincible Frieza. And we know in hindsight that Frieza's not invincible, but he's presented to the viewers in that light at that point in time. So no, Pain is not necessarily the strongest Akatsuki member just because this statement says so. On the other hand, the third data book does say that Pain rules the Akatsuki, and as an explanation for why the incredibly powerful individual Akatsuki members even bother listening to Pain in the first place, we get a statement that the leader's will is absolute, and that Pain has charisma and power that no one can deny. He's even described as the invincible leader of the Akatsuki, with Obito being described as the behind-the-scenes leader. Their relationship is described as vaguely similar to the Kage and the Daimyo. The Daimyo are ultimately in charge of and give orders to the Kage and their shinobi, but the Kage are obviously way more physically powerful than the Daimyo, so whether you think Obito could beat Pain in a fight, the statement is obviously referring to Pain here. As for the Itachi statement, the sheer coincidence thing, that one is 100% accurate. The fourth databook explains this in extremely clear detail. I'll quote, "While alive, Itachi encountered Naruto by chance, and granted him Shisui's Sharingan." Honestly, that's it. That's all we need. We have the hype statement, and we have the databook statement. Itachi and Naruto clearly and explicitly meet by coincidence. But let's say you're unaware of the databooks, and like me, you read the volume releases and never saw that hype statement in the first place. You don't need either of those things to understand what's happening in this scene. You do need to have read the chapters this scene takes place in, which apparently is a lot to ask, so I'll just go over it real quick. First of all, Itachi isn't hiding in the goddamn bushes. He's walking through the forest. He's headed for the Akatsuki hideout in search of Sasuke. He's dying and has made up his mind to find Sasuke and die in battle to him, so he can help Sasuke awaken his Mangekyo abilities. He is pursuing Sasuke. Not Naruto, Sasuke. Well, what about the in pursuit of Itachi thing? Naruto is pursuing Itachi because he thinks it'll lead him to Sasuke. Sasuke is also out hunting for the Akatsuki because he thinks that will lead him to Itachi. So, Naruto and Sasuke are each independently searching for Itachi. No one here is looking for Naruto. The only one out for Naruto is Pain. Itachi isn't looking for Naruto to intentionally put the crow into him either. When Itachi first runs into Naruto, he isn't sure whether to trust him or to even take him seriously. He presses him on whether or not Naruto is capable of sticking to his worldview even under duress. He challenges Naruto on whether or not he can weigh Sasuke's life against that of the village. And only after Naruto sufficiently proves his loyalty and steadfastness, then does Itachi give him the crow. Again, the fourth databook makes this abundantly clear. I'll quote, "The reason Itachi entrusted it to Naruto, it being the crow, with what Itachi perceived inside of Naruto was that by being simply honest in his passionate thoughts of being friends and a heart pursuing justice in truth. because it was none other than Naruto who could discover it. Calling Sasuke a friend, Naruto swears that he will protect his friend at the risk of his own life. As Naruto shouted that his ninja way would never bend, Itachi saw the future and hope in Naruto. Again, we don't need the databook statement at all to understand what's happening in this scene, but there it is anyway for context. Itachi wasn't running around looking for Naruto. Like, if he hadn't bumped into Naruto then and there, Itachi wouldn't have, wandered off to Konoha to find him, before then going back to confronting Sasuke. Itachi even implied that he expected Naruto to run from the encounter outright. Instead, Naruto convinced Itachi of his commitment to both his friendship with Sasuke and his own ninja way, and that sparked the conversation that led to him getting the crow. I think the debaters maybe just forgot how Itachi and Naruto bumped into each other in the first place. Remember, at this point in the story, Karin has just had Jugo's birds scatter scraps of clothing with Sasuke's scent on them all over the forest. Naruto, in turn, has split himself up into multiple shadow clones and is pursuing every one. The reason Itachi and Naruto bump into each other is because they all happen to be in the same area at the same time, and Naruto using shadow clones makes the encounter more likely. To recap, Naruto is looking for Sasuke, Sasuke is looking for Itachi, Itachi is looking for Sasuke, no one in this scene is looking for Naruto. Pain, in the previous chapter, is looking for Naruto because he wants to go get the Nine Tails. He's literally the only one who's narratively actively pursuing Naruto. This whole tangent of the conversation was completely unnecessary. I get the feeling that Noodles is well aware of that too, but benefit of the doubt, let me just say this. If you're in a debate with someone and you get into a gridlock about semantics like this, just pause, take a breather, and go back and reread the chapter you're talking about. This entire side arc could have been avoided if the debaters just agreed to a temporary ceasefire and went and checked the manga for context. That's assuming both debaters are willing to argue in good faith, that is. Alright, we're done with the main arguments. Here, I just wanted to list a few minor points that came up. I don't think they need their own sections, but I did want to touch on them briefly before wrapping up. First off, it's a little disappointing that they didn't talk about the Geto statue at all. Maybe they consider it part of Nagato's abilities rather than Pain's, but it's still a really cool thing and I wish they had discussed it. Noodles saying that he doesn't consider Konan to be an Akatsuki member is just weird and really makes me wonder about how closely he reads the manga. Konan was one of the 3 founding members of the Akatsuki, along with Yahiko and Nagato. If you want to argue that Obito should count as a 4th member, since he pressured them into creating the Akatsuki in its current state, that's fine, but Konan is one of the founding members either way. I think he's just implying that since she doesn't have as many combat feats or dedicated fights, she's less impressive overall, which A, doesn't mean she's not an Akatsuki member, but B, is funny because even Obito says during their fight in chapter 509, I didn't take you seriously enough, and come to think of it, you are a former Akatsuki member. Also, if you compare the amount of damage that Konan does to Obito in this fight, adult Obito that is, to the amount of damage Minato did to Kid Obito, Konan hurts Obito more than Minato, if not more, and this is before using the Sea of Paper Bombs, which nearly kills Obito. Obito himself also says he would have died to Konan if not for the Izanagi. Konan is no joke. For this claim that Itachi can focus at light speed for the Amaterasu, the debaters never actually scaled Itachi to light speed. Noodles just kept claiming over and over again that Itachi had light speed focus. I wonder if maybe he thinks that since our eyes perceive light, that our focus works at the speed of light as well, which is absolutely not the case. It takes time for the signals to reach our brains, for the muscles in our eyes to shift them around and focus on things, and none of that is light speed, just because the photons hitting our retinas are. But even if Itachi's eyes can focus on something at light speed, the Amaterasu itself has a build-up time. Itachi needs to amass chakra in his eye, then release it. This doesn't happen instantaneously. You'd need to demonstrate all that being light speed as well. And Nagato is able to detect this happening. We see him calling out Itachi amassing chakra in his eye during the Edo fight, which could give Pain an opportunity to prepare a counter. Also, I'm pretty sure the 4th Raikage wasn't moving at the speed of light at the time that he dodged the Amaterasu that Sasuke used on him, so unless you're going to argue that Sasuke's Amaterasu is slower than Itachi's, the Amaterasu's travel time is sublight anyway, so Itachi having light speed focus wouldn't mean he could set his targets on fire with Amaterasu at the speed of light. For the claim that Sasuke's Rinnegan resisted the infinite Tsukuyomi, not exactly. It was the light from the Susanoo that distorted or blocked the light reflecting off the moon. You could argue that the Susanoo is an extension of the Rinnegan, so this counts as Rinnegan Jutsu, but it wasn't like a Genjutsu clash that Sasuke won. He did say he thought he'd be able to break others out of the Tsukuyomi with his Rinnegan though, but that's a separate thing. For the claim that Pain is the best at using the Rinnegan because of the number of paths and abilities he uses, I don't really know how to evaluate this. I think it's enough to just state that he's an extremely skilled shinobi, and that he's clearly highly skilled with dojutsu overall, since using the paths of pain at all is dojutsu. But is he really better than Obito, who was controlling multiple Biju and his own paths of pain with one Rinnegan during the war arc? I don't think so. For the claim that Nagato was neither of Senju nor Uchiha blood, this is wrong. In chapter 606, Obito tells us that Nagato is of Senju bloodline. Remember, Nagato is an Uzumaki, and the Uzumaki are related to the Senju. During the Pain vs Naruto fight, Naruto makes the decision to prioritize taking out the Naraka path, and Noodles is of the opinion that that decision was a misplay. It absolutely was not a misplay. Not only did Katsuyu specifically call out the Naraka path as the key player, which the debaters partially acknowledged, but think about what would happen if Naruto focused exclusively on Tendo rather than taking Naraka out first. If Naruto starts engaging in an extended taijutsu clash with Tendo, that just gives the Naraka path more time to resurrect the other paths, which would include the animal path, the Asura path, and the human path at that point. The more opportunities Pain has to keep resurrecting the other paths, which could allow him to win a war of attrition. If Naruto does take the Naraka path out first, he's guaranteeing that any other path he kills stays dead. Killing Naraka first is the correct decision. For the claim that the dog summons don't scale to anything, the dogs have maneuverability feats in the Pain arc and the Jiraiya fight. You might not find them impressive, and that's fine, but it's also more helpful to examine them in context than to just dismiss them outright. They're also shown to have excellent durability, although it's unconventional, relying on the self-replicating summoning jutsu rather than raw DC, but still. For the claim that Sage Naruto scales above 6 Tails or even 8 Tails Naruto, it could take a while to do my due diligence on this one, but the short answer is that this is very, very unlikely. For example, just look at the size and power of the Biju bomb the 6 Tails uses compared to the Chibaku Tensei crater and the size of the frogs and all that. Now compare that to the size of the craters created by the Rasen shuriken as a general metric for AP. Keep in mind that Sage Naruto runs out of chakra after only using 2 Rasen shuriken. The 6 Tails probably has way more chakra than that. Also consider that Sage Naruto was effortlessly yoinked by the Bansho Tenin, whereas 6 Tails straight up recoiled the Shinra Tensei. 6 Tails uses 2 Biju bombs and doesn't seem to slow down in the least. He then powers up with the 8 Tails transformation and busts out of Chibaku Tensei. Weigh that against the fact that Sage Mode is completely drained after Naruto uses 2 Rasen Shuriken. We could also go over the Naruto and Orochimaru fight and look at the destructive and durability feats there and try to scale those up to a 6 Tails Naruto, then compare that with Sage Mode. We could also look at Naruto's fight with Kurama in the Sanctuary, so there's potentially some room for debate. But overall, Sage Mode is just limited by the amount of nature energy Naruto can hold at any given point, and his ability to use his top tier jutsu is pretty limited as well. Maybe Sage Mode is more powerful in short bursts, but overall it has some serious limitations that don't seem to apply to the 6 Tails transformation. And finally, as for Amaterasu being the strongest jutsu, yeah, no, I disagree on this one. Kamui alone is arguably much stronger. It counters the Amaterasu, it can delete body parts, it can just outright take people off the battlefield and eliminate targets instantly. Compare that to the Amaterasu that takes time to burn its targets down and can be countered in a pretty wide variety of ways. The Kamui also gives Obito insane survivability. It could be a rock, paper, scissors sort of thing though. The Amaterasu might be stronger in certain situations and the Kamui might be stronger in other matchups. And with that, I think we're pretty much done. Those were all the major issues I was hoping to cover for the video. I'd love to hear what you think about all this. Whether you agree or disagree with any of the points that I've made, please share your thoughts in the comments section. By way of conclusion, I want to start by thanking you for diving down this rabbit hole with me. It's kind of amazing to me to see all the interest in and passion for Naruto as a series still thriving decades after its debut. I also have a lot of appreciation for the folks who dedicate so much of their time and effort to analyzing and exploring the series, even the ones I disagree with, and I hope I've done my part here to contribute to that conversation in a positive way. Before I wrap this up, I'd like to leave you with one final thought. Over the past 3.5 hours, we've gone into pretty exhaustive detail about a lot of pretty technical things. calculating movement speed and combat speed, talking about eye biology and genjutsu resistances, the semantic definitions of a bunch of terms, all that. By comparison, we spent very little time talking about the themes and messages of the series, the heart and soul of the narrative. I really do love making these videos, and I love spending time really trying to understand the mechanics of Kishimoto's universe, but I do think it's important not to lose sight of those messages. At its core, Naruto is a story about compassion, empathy, and understanding, about understanding the relationship between pain and conflict, and striving to break free of that cycle of conflict and make genuine connections with others despite your differences. Let's all try to keep that in mind as we continue to discuss the series with one another. Thanks for listening.